Hey guys, tonight we begin with the turbulent, scandal-soaked saga of the medieval papacy, a story that takes us far beyond incense and solemn hymns. Picture this moonlight slanting through the cracked windows of a centuries-old cathedral, the scent of wax and dust lingering in the air. Somewhere beneath that hallowed dome, holy men debate politics. Wine flows more freely than holy water, and backroom deals are brokered over the fate of kings and kingdoms. Because when it came to spiritual leadership in the Middle Ages, holiness was optional, ambition was not. Let's start by remembering what the papacy was supposed to be: the sacred seat of St. Peter, a beacon of morality, humility, and divine guidance. In theory, the Pope was the vicar of Christ on earth. In practice, well, let's just say the job description got a few unofficial edits. Especially once Europe realized that whoever wore the mitre controlled land armies and a terrifying number of taxes. Now imagine medieval Europe as a massive clunky board game full of rival factions, fiefdoms, and bishops with better armor than theology degrees. In that setting, the papacy wasn't just a religious office, it was the ultimate prize. And surprise spiritual qualifications weren't always the deciding factor. Being born into the right family, making the right alliances, or slipping the right amount of gold into the right robe-lined sleeve could all work wonders. The papal election process, such as it was, didn't help much. Before the reforms of later centuries, there was no airtight system to prevent interference. Local Roman nobles jostled for control. Foreign monarchs meddled. Cardinals formed cliques with more scheming than a medieval drama troupe. And when bribes failed well, there were always swords. One recurring problem was that the Pope, despite technically being elected by cardinals, was often the puppet of whatever noble family had the most muscle or coin. In some cases, he was from that noble family, the spiritual leader of the Western world. More like the most well-connected cousin at a very corrupt family reunion. The Holy See quickly became a power throne with spiritual garnish. It could bless or damn, crown or depose, and when necessary, fund military campaigns that made turn the other cheek feel like a clerical typo. The Pope wasn't just a shepherd of souls. He was often a political broker, landlord, military financier, and on bad days, a walking tabloid scandal. Take, for example, the ever-growing problem of simony, the sale of church offices. Want to be a bishop? That'll cost you. Want to be a cardinal doublet? Want to become pope? Well, now we're talking serious coin. It turned what was meant to be a calling into an auction. The spiritual became transactional, and the consequences rippled through every cathedral and chapel in Christendom. Meanwhile, the people, those average peasants, lighting candles and praying in Latin they didn't understand, remained mostly unaware of the real circus unfolding at the top. They saw the grandeur, the robes, the rituals. What they didn't see was the power struggle backstage. They didn't know that some popes had mistresses, others led armies, and at least one held a courtroom trial against a decomposing predecessor. More on that soon. So how did it all begin to go so sideways? The rot didn't happen overnight. The early medieval church was struggling to define its authority after the collapse of the Roman Empire. The line between church and state wasn't just blurry, it was more of a smudge. And with emperors trying to control the church and popes trying to outmaneuver emperors, things got complicated. Fast. Some popes genuinely tried to reform the system. Others saw a nice opportunity for self-improvement, complete with vineyards banquets, and relatives mysteriously elevated to high office. The 9th to 15th centuries were especially rich in what we'll call spiritual missteps. And that's putting it gently. There were teenage popes, popes who gambled, popes who poisoned, popes who built moats around their palaces to keep enemies and sometimes mistresses at bay. There were popes who died mysteriously, others who came back to power more times than a soap opera villain. And at one point, Europe had 3 popes at once, all excommunicating each other in a spiritual showdown that made the Reformation seem, in hindsight, kind of inevitable. But here's the twist: through all the scandal the papacy endured, somehow, this ever-messy, politically entangled institution not only survived, it grew more powerful. That may say something troubling about humanity, or it may simply mean that institutions like people are very good at pretending everything's fine, as long as the candles stay lit and the choir keeps singing. So tonight, as we drift into the tales of scandalous popes, remember that this is less a story about religion and more a story about power. Who wants it, who fights for it, and what they're willing to sacrifice to keep it. We'll meet popes who turned cathedrals into casinos, who treated holy orders like party invites, and who made the Vatican look more like a political war room than a sanctuary. But for now, rest easy. This is just the beginning. We've only dipped a toe into the holy waters of medieval mischief. And trust me, things are going to get a lot stranger. Power in medieval Europe didn't just flow through swords and castles. It flowed through altars and incense, through Latin prayers and sealed scrolls. And at the center of it all sat the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, with one foot planted firmly on sacred ground, and the other very often ankle-deep in family politics. Because in practice, the papacy wasn't just a divine office, it was a dynastic opportunity. And in Rome, nothing said God's will quite like making sure your nephew got a cardinal's hat. Let's talk about the noble families of Rome and how they came to see the Holy See, not as a seat of spiritual responsibility, but as the ultimate family business. The Tusculum family, for instance, treated the papacy like an inheritance to be passed down alongside vineyards and country estates. Between the 10th and 11th centuries, they managed to install no fewer than 3 popes from their clan. That's not a coincidence, that's a resume. One of the reasons this was possible is that during this era, Rome was a city-state unto itself, and whoever controlled the city's armed forces could, with the right timing, ensure their preferred pope got elected. Election in this context didn't mean a humble gathering of prayerful clergy. It often meant bribery threats, and in some cases, the sudden disappearance of rival candidates. It was democracy, the way a lion elects its dinner. The papacy became an extension of noble ambitions. Installing a family member as pope came with perks: access to vast church revenues, immunity from secular prosecution, and the power to appoint allies or relatives to lucrative church positions across Europe. It was like winning the jackpot, if the jackpot came with gold soldiers and the occasional divine endorsement. This gave rise to a whole generation of papal princes, noble sons, who didn't have the stomach for war, but could still wear a robe convincingly. If your oldest son was off being a knight, and your second son couldn't even lift a sword without injuring himself, well, no problem. He'd make a fine pope. And once he was in office, the nepotism could begin in earnest. Nephew in this era was often shorthand for illegitimate son, where pretending is a cousin. These nephews were given bishoprics, abbeys, and administrative posts, sometimes before they were old enough to shave. It was not uncommon to see 12-year-old cardinals wandering around Vatican corridors, looking vaguely confused but fabulously dressed. One notable practitioner of this strategy was Pope John XIX. Originally a layman, meaning he had no clerical training whatsoever. He went from being a Roman noble to supreme pontiff in the time it takes to schedule a haircut. His qualifications: he was the brother of the previous pope. His theological background dubious at best, but his political connections impeccable. This kind of dynastic continuity was not subtle. Sometimes the papacy stayed within the same family for generations. At other times, it passed between feuding clans like a very sacred football. And when things got particularly tense, noble families weren't above a little violence to tilt the odds. There are records of armed mobs storming basilicas during papal elections, shouting the name of their preferred candidate while swinging clubs. It's not exactly how St. Peter imagined things going, even when noble families weren't directly putting forward their own kin. They were deeply involved in who got to be pope. They controlled the streets of Rome, the flow of information, and importantly, the keys to the Lateran Palace. If you couldn't get into the building, you couldn't become pope. It was less divine intervention, more logistics and muscle. There were also the perks of papal power that made the job irresistible. A pope could grant lands pardon, sins bless armies, and collect taxes. He could make a rival disappear under a cloud of excommunication, or raise an obscure relative to sainthood with a little well-timed canonization. In the hands of the ambitious, it was an unmatched tool for family advancement. And let's not forget the spectacle. Being pope wasn't just about decisions, it was about drama. The coronation process alone was a medieval power display: lavish robes, golden mitres, processions through Rome, and enough incense to smoke out an entire cathedral. For a noble family looking to cement its legacy, nothing compared to seeing a son or cousin seated on the throne of St. Peter. Of course, this all came at a cost, both spiritual and political. The more the papacy became entangled with noble interests, the further it drifted from its religious mission. Critics emerged, not just from outside the church, but within it. Monks, theologians, and even other clergy began to ask quietly at first, and then more loudly, was the church serving God, or just another powerful Roman family? That question would echo for centuries. But during the height of this dynastic influence, it barely registered above the sound of ceremonial trumpets and rustling silk. The noble families weren't interested in reform. They were interested in results. And as long as the papacy offered power, wealth, and a gilded stage, they were determined to keep it in the family. So next time you picture the medieval pope in solemn prayer, add a few wrinkles, a noble coat of arms stitched into his vestments, a nephew counting coins in the next room, and a cardinal uncle checking the map for family land holdings. Because in the Middle Ages, the papal chair wasn't just sacred, it was strategic. And in Rome, holy ambition always ran deep. In the long and bewildering list of papal oddities, few entries light up the scandal board quite like Pope John VII. If medieval popes were supposed to be paragons of virtue, John was more of a cautionary tale in silk. He didn't ascend to the papacy with a history of theological study or saintly conduct. He arrived with a famous last name, a well-connected father, and what can only be described as Renaissance frat boy energy. He was 18 years old when he became pope. That's right, 18. Barely old enough to rent a donkey in some parts of Europe, yet somehow in charge of the entire Catholic Church. His real name was Octavianus, which honestly sounds like someone who would already have a gladiator helmet and a reality show deal. But in 955, thanks to the political maneuverings of his powerful father, Duke Alberic II of Spoleto, young Octavianus was elected Pope John III. It was less a calling and more a coronation arranged over dinner. Now, to be fair, being a teenager is hard. Hormones, peer pressure, existential dread, all standard fare. But most teenagers don't also control the keys to the Lateran Palace, have access to the Vatican treasury, and get to sign decrees that alter the fate of nations. And John IV didn't exactly rise to the occasion with saintly restraint. Instead of reforming the church or contemplating salvation, John approached the papacy with the enthusiasm of someone who'd just inherited an amusement park. He transformed the sacred halls of the papal residence into a party palace. There were rumors, so many rumors, that the Lateran became a brothel under his reign. Not metaphorically, literally. Pilgrims hoping for spiritual renewal may have accidentally wandered into something that looked more like a toga-themed disaster. Chroniclers of the time, never shy about dramatic flair, accused him of drinking excessively, gambling during official audiences, and even toasting to pagan gods in the middle of Christian feast days. Imagine a pope rolling dice while cursing loudly and throwing a coin to Mars. The man had range. One infamous story describes him ordaining a deacon in a horse stable, which, while certainly convenient, isn't exactly canonical. Another claims he used church funds to buy gifts for his mistresses, some of whom were married, some of whom were nuns, and one of whom was probably just trying to drop off bread before being swept into ecclesiastical debauchery. And if his personal life was chaotic, his political maneuverings weren't much better. He played local Roman factions off one another like a bored puppet master, and then, when things got dicey, called in the German Emperor Otto I for help. Otto dutifully came, restored some order, and was crowned emperor by John. In return, John promised loyalty and spiritual support. That promise lasted roughly the time it takes to say Amen. No sooner had Otto turned his back than John started plotting against him again. It was the medieval version of ghosting your pen pal and then egging his castle. Otto, furious and now fully aware that trusting an 18-year-old with absolute power might not have been the wisest call, returned to Rome and called a synod to formally depose him. The synod's list of accusations reads like a list of commandments, all broken with gusto: perjury, murder, sacrilege, simony, incest, and more. John, for his part, fled. But not for long. In one of history's stranger comebacks, John returned to Rome after Otto left and reasserted control. It was less a triumphant restoration and more a chaotic episode of Pope gone wild. And then, just as suddenly as he'd risen, it ended. In 964, John XIII reportedly died of a stroke while in bed with a married woman. Some say it was divine retribution. Others suspect the woman's husband had opinions and possibly a club. Either way, it was not a quiet passing surrounded by praying cardinals. It was messy, scandalous, and somehow entirely on brand. Historians today still debate just how exaggerated the stories of John Lestart's reign might be. Medieval chroniclers were not exactly known for subtlety, and many had political agendas. But even if only half the accusations are true, they paint a picture of a pope who treated the most sacred office in Christendom like a Renaissance rave. His legacy, well, it's a mixed bag. On one hand, he didn't exactly elevate the spiritual tone of the church. On the other, he remains a perfect symbol of what happens when absolute power meets zero maturity. And for the medieval papacy, he was just the beginning. The blueprint, perhaps, for a whole new genre of scandal. So next time you're wondering whether youth and power can coexist peacefully, remember Pope John the Thorned. He may not have written any great theological treatises or led any sweeping reforms, but he did leave a memorable impression, etched not in marble, but in the collective side-eye of every monk who lived through his reign. And as we move forward through our parade of scandalous popes, keep John Thwaind in mind. He set the tone. Not holy, not humble, just chaotically human. If Pope John V's teenage hijinks were the warm-up act, what followed was a string of equally eyebrow-raising episodes that cemented the medieval papacy's reputation for chaos. But before we dive into another cast of colorful characters, let's linger just a moment longer in the swirling smoke of John's legacy, because the aftermath was almost as scandalous as his reign. You see, popes don't usually leave behind cleanup crews, but John did. After his death in flagrante delicto, or possibly inclubatus domesticus, his enemies wasted no time scrubbing his name from every holy scroll they could find. His successor, Pope Leo V, was installed under the watchful eye of Emperor Otto I, who had absolutely had it with Rome's political whiplash. Leo was supposed to bring order, sobriety, and some semblance of adult supervision back to the papal office. But the problem with trying to enforce order in Rome was that the Romans still lived there. John X, despite his scandalous reign, had built a network of supporters who weren't thrilled about Leo VIII's imperial connections. A power struggle erupted. Again, riots broke out. Leo fled. Then came Benedict V, who was elected by the Roman populace in defiance of Otto's candidate. This led to a standoff in which, believe it or not, two popes attempted to papally coexist for a time. Theologically questionable, yes. Politically confusing, absolutely. Eventually, Benedict was deposed after being forced to kneel before Leo and have his papal staff broken over his head in front of a disapproving imperial audience. Subtle it was not. All of this reveals something critical about the papacy. At the time, it was less a stable institution and more a very expensive hat that got passed around, occasionally hurled, and sometimes sold. Which brings us to a particularly creative form of papal scandal gambling. And no, not metaphorically. Medieval chroniclers were appalled to learn that Pope John V enjoyed dice games to the point of playing them during actual papal audiences. Yes, while bishops and diplomats waited to discuss weighty matters like heresy and the Holy Roman Empire, John was rolling for doubles and possibly swearing in Latin. Reports claim He even invoked pagan gods for good luck, which was not exactly what you'd call orthodox strategy. A little too much Mars, not enough Matthew. To the pious and terrified faithful, this was a sign that the end times were probably on the calendar. A pope not just sitting in private, but flaunting it in the open, and in the Lateran Palace, no less, which by then was starting to resemble a poorly managed tavern. At least one chronicler referred to John's lifestyle as sorter-like, which is medieval monk code for Caligula, but make it liturgical, and his excesses weren't confined to games and drinks. The Lateran itself became infamous under John's rule for its banquets, which blurred the line between sacrament and scandal. The details get fuzzy, possibly on purpose, but enough accounts remain to suggest that the papal palace hosted events that would make a Roman emperor blink. Toasting to pagan deities, raucous carousing, and let's just say an extremely flexible interpretation of clerical celibacy. Then came the accusations of violence. Yes, violence. Not on a battlefield, but right inside papal politics. John the Fiend is said to have ordered the mutilation of several rivals. One man had his eyes gouged out, another lost his tongue. Whether these tales were exaggerated by political enemies or not, the effect was the same. The Pope's reputation plummeted from scandalous to downright terrifying. By the time the German Emperor returned to Rome furious and determined to sort things out, John's legacy was sealed. And when he died, likely from a stroke, possibly from a husband-shaped blunt object, the Vatican entered a period of collective silence. A sort of spiritual, let's never talk about this again moment. But history, of course, does talk about it. Often, with great relish. What makes John Phaeton's story so compelling isn't just the dramatic flair. It's that his papacy marked the point where even the church couldn't pretend everything was fine. The scandals had become too public, too bold, and too embarrassing. And yet, it wouldn't be the last time a pope treated the papacy like a personal playground. Not by a long shot. In fact, John XIII might be considered the original blueprint for the bad pope archetype, a figure who appears again and again in the Middle Ages like a recurring boss battle. Power unchecked, youth untempered, influence unearned. The formula wasn't new, but in the hands of someone like John, it became dangerously theatrical. He made no attempt to hide his excesses. No whispered apologies, no hushed affairs. Just open indulgence, public vice, and a smirk that echoed through the stained glass windows. And what's worse, or maybe just historically poetic, is that despite everything the papacy endured, the throne of St. Peter, stained by dice drink and betrayal, remained occupied. Successors came and went, some more holy, others just more discreet. But the office survived, because the church, like all ancient institutions, had learned an essential trick. If the robes stay clean and the incense keeps burning, most people will squint and pretend not to notice the wine stains on the altar. So we move on deeper into the Middle Ages, where scandal was no longer an exception, but an occupational hazard. And as we're about to see, one pope's teenage gambling addiction was just the start. Wait until the papal office gets bought, sold, and gifted like a prized coat at a noble wedding. But we'll get there soon enough. Now that we've survived Pope John XIII's raucous reign, it's time to meet someone who looked at the papacy not as a spiritual calling, not even as a party venue, but as personal property. enter Pope Benedict IX, a man so uniquely scandalous that history didn't just try to erase him. It had to keep writing him back in. Why? Because he was Pope not once, not twice, but 3 separate times. And not because of his theological insight or personal charisma. No, Benedict's repeated appearances on the papal throne read more like a landlord who refuses to give up his lease, no matter how many times he's evicted. Our story begins in the year 1032, when a young man, probably around age 20 though, estimates vary, was elected pope. He was born Theophylactus of Tusculum, and yes, that last name should ring a scandal-shaped bell. The Tusculum family, as mentioned earlier, had turned papal appointments into a family tradition, and young Theophylactus was just the latest entry in their sacred game of Monopoly. His qualifications for the papacy largely non-existent, but his family connections were strong, and in Rome at the time, that was more than enough. And so, with the holy oil barely dried on his forehead, Benedict ascended to the papal throne. What followed was less a reign and more a medieval soap opera. Chroniclers who, by this point, must have had permanent ink-stained eye rolls, described his behavior as disgraceful, immoral, and offensive to God and man. And medieval chroniclers, mind you, were not exactly known for exaggeration unless they really, really meant it. Accusations against Benedict IX included bribery, simony orgies in the papal palace, and a general sense of, please someone stop this man. He was said to have brought wild animals into the Vatican, possibly as pets, possibly as party entertainment. One historian wrote that Benedict feasted on the sins of the flesh, which is essentially monk speak. For this guy makes Dionysus look like a choir boy. Eventually, Rome had had enough. In 1044, a popular uprising forced Benedict from the city. One might think that would be the end of his papal story. But no, he returned the next year, barging back into the Lateran like an unwelcome ex at a wedding, and reclaimed his old seat. He declared himself pope once more, citing divine right, noble blood, and presumably a very short memory. But here's where things get downright surreal. Sometime around 1045, Benedict IX decided he didn't want to be pope anymore. Not because of remorse, not because he saw the light, but because, brace yourself, he wanted to get married. Yes, the Supreme Pontiff, spiritual leader of the Western Church, apparently fell in love. And like a medieval Romeo with a mitre, he thought the best way to win his beloved's heart was to sell the papacy. That's right, he didn't resign. He sold the office of Pope for cash. His godfather, conveniently a priest named Giovanni Gratian, was the buyer. Known for being devout and shockingly not terrible, Giovanni took the papal name Gregory VI. Historians generally agree that Gregory wanted to clean up the mess and restore dignity to the church. But the manner of his acquisition, literal simony, raised some heavenly eyebrows. Even if his motives were noble, the method was not. Meanwhile, Benedict, having exchanged the Holy See for a purse of gold, rode off into the Roman countryside to pursue his love interest. Unfortunately for him, the lady in question was reportedly unimpressed. Whether due to the scandal, the baggage, or just a general distaste for ex-popes, she declined his romantic overtures. And so, in true dramatic fashion, Benedict decided to reclaim what he believed was still rightfully his. He returned to Rome yet again in 1047, marking the third time he assumed the papacy. This comeback was less triumphant and more exasperated sigh. The church, already stretched thin, trying to explain why the Pope had changed hands 3 times in 2 years, now faced the absurdity of 3 competing claimants to the papal throne: Benedict IX, Gregory XVI, and another rival, Pope Sylvester III, who had briefly filled the void during one of Benedict's sabbaticals. This mess, now known as one of the most chaotic moments in church history, prompted intervention from the Holy Roman Emperor Henry III. He marched into Rome in 1049, held a synod, and declared all 3 popes invalid, a clean slate. He then appointed a new, more acceptable candidate, Pope Clement II. Benedict, now excommunicated and politically neutered, finally left the scene. For good this time. Probably. He faded into obscurity, his final years cloaked in historical uncertainty. But his legacy, well, that's been sealed in bold italics. He remains the only pope in history to have sold the papacy like a used carriage. Not once, not twice, but 3 times he held that office. 3 times he sat on the throne of St. Peter, and 0 times did he demonstrate anything approaching spiritual leadership. His story is a perfect crystallization of how far the medieval papacy had wandered from its roots. What began as a seat of humble service had in Benedict IX's hands become something transactional, theatrical, and profoundly absurd. And if you're wondering whether it ever got better, yes, but not immediately. There were more scandals ahead, more feuds, more uncles promoting nephews, and nephews turning on uncles. But Benedict IX stands out even in that crowded field of drama, because in an age where the papacy could be bought, bargained, and inherited, he treated it like a summer job. He just couldn't quit. If you've been keeping count, we've already seen popes who were teenagers, gamblers, party throwers, and 3-time office holders. Now it's time to explore the glue that held all this together: nepotism. Sweet, shameless, unapologetic nepotism. In the Middle Ages, nepotism wasn't just a flaw in the system, it was the system. If today's popes carefully avoid the appearance of favoritism, their medieval predecessors did the opposite. They handed out power to relatives like they were tossing out communion wafers at Easter Mass. The word itself comes from the Latin nepos, meaning nephew, which is fitting because popes were constantly giving jobs to their nephews, many of whom were, let's be honest, just thinly disguised sons. Celibacy was technically a requirement, but the enforcement was, let's say, gently optional. It was more of a guideline than a vow. And once those nephews arrived, they were promptly installed in high-ranking church offices: cardinals, bishops, even archbishops. It was like, take your child to work day, except the child became Archbishop of Florence by lunchtime. One of the boldest practitioners of papal nepotism was Pope Sixtus IV. His reign in the late 15th century saw the promotion of so many family members to high office that the Vatican resembled a Sunday dinner gone rogue. Brothers, cousins, nephews, they all got a slice of the sacred pie. Sixtus had a nephew named Giuliano della Rovere, who would later become Pope Julius II, the one who marched into battle in armor. So at least nepotism occasionally produced entertainment value. Under Sixtus, papal appointments were less about merit and more about making sure the family brand stayed strong. He elevated 6 nephews to the rank of Cardinal 6 and handed out lucrative benefices like party favors. These weren't symbolic roles either. Each post came with land income, political clout, and sometimes a private villa or two. But perhaps the most eye-popping case of papal nepotism, and one of the most influential, came later with Pope Alexander VI, otherwise known as Rodrigo Borgia. Now that family deserves its own Netflix series. Rodrigo didn't just elevate his children, he celebrated them publicly, lavishly, shamelessly. His son Cesare Borgia was made a cardinal at the age of 18, despite his obvious preference for armor over incense. His daughter Lucrezia became a duchess, a marriage diplomat, and depending on which sources you read, a poisoner and innocent pawn, or a Renaissance-era PR nightmare. Rodrigo had no patience for secrecy. While earlier popes tried to pass off their children as nephews, Alexander just acknowledged them outright. "Yes, those are my kids," he essentially declared, "and they're fabulous." He hosted extravagant banquets for them, bought them palaces, and used church funds to support their political ambitions. The Vatican, under Alexander VI, was more Versailles than Vatican. It shimmered with silk, echoed with music, and occasionally, if rumors are true, echoed with cries from the infamous banquet of chestnuts. We'll touch on that later softly. Now this may all sound ludicrous, but from the perspective of these popes, it was logical. If you were going to rule the church like a monarch, why not build a dynasty? Monarchs had heirs. Monarchs secured power through family. The popes, despite their vows, were doing the same, just with better Latin and slightly more guilt. The fallout, of course, was immense. Appointing unqualified relatives to powerful positions led to incompetence, corruption, and internal feuds. Some cardinals, barely literate, were tasked with theological decisions that shaped European doctrine. Others used their offices to enrich themselves, exploit land holdings, and host wild parties. Church credibility sagged under the weight of all this favoritism. Reformers noticed. Angry monks noticed. And eventually, so did the laity. In fact, nepotism was one of the central grievances that helped spark the Protestant Reformation. When Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the door in Wittenberg, he wasn't just mad about indulgences. He was furious that the Vatican operated like a noble court rather than a spiritual institution. When salvation itself could be negotiated between your uncle, the Pope, and your cousin, the Cardinal, what was left of divine justice? But the practice persisted in part because the system rewarded it. Promoting relatives created loyalty. It protected power. It ensured that the Pope's wishes were carried out without resistance. And in an era when betrayal was common and assassination wasn't exactly rare, stacking the Vatican with family members felt safer than trusting strangers. Not every nepotism case ended in disaster, of course. Some nephews turned out to be competent administrators or even reformers. But the overwhelming pattern was clear: family came first. Always. God one suspects came second. Or third, if there was a banquet involved. It's important to remember that medieval Europe wasn't shocked by this behavior. Kings did it. Dukes did it. Mayors did it. Why wouldn't popes? The line between sacred and secular was so blurred that it's surprising they didn't just start minting coins with the Pope's family crest on one side and a cheeky wink on the other. Eventually, reforms tried to curb the practice. The Council of Trent, held in the mid-16th century, attempted to crack down on nepotism and simony. New rules were introduced. transparency was encouraged, and popes began to take their public image a bit more seriously. But the golden age of papal favoritism, those centuries when a cardinal's red hat was often stitched by his uncle, left a long shadow. Even today, the term nepotism carries the weight of that legacy. It's not just favoritism, it's history, it's scandal, it's popes quietly slipping family names onto divine paperwork. So the next time you hear of a high-ranking official promoting their nephew, cousin, or son, just remember, the Vatican did it first, and in far more elaborate robes. Let's talk about Simone. If nepotism was the Vatican's favorite family hobby, then Simone was its favorite side hustle. The term refers to the buying and selling of church offices, and it's named rather appropriately after Simon Magus, a sorcerer from the Book of Acts, who tried to buy the power of the Holy Spirit. It did not go well for Simon, and in theory, the church condemned such behavior. In practice, they simply put a price tag on it. In the Middle Ages, simony became one of the most widespread and corrosive corruptions within the Catholic Church. Virtually every office was for sale. Want to become a bishop? Pay up. Need a parish? Show me the silver. Fancy being a cardinal? Better bring a cart. And if you wanted to become pope, well, let's just say you needed both cash and connections, and preferably a few nephews to grease the gears. Simony turned the sacred into the transactional. It wasn't just that church offices were being sold. It was that they were being sold to the highest bidder, regardless of their qualifications. The result, dioceses run by illiterate nobles' parishes, handed off like real estate, and church doctrine, shaped by men whose only theological training was a well-aimed coin toss. Take the papal court itself. Over time, it evolved into a kind of spiritual marketplace, complete with courtiers, fixers, and a thriving behind-the-scenes economy. Need a dispensation? There's a fee. Want an indulgence? That'll cost extra. Even pardons for sins could be obtained for the right price, nothing like absolution with a receipt. The damage Simone inflicted wasn't just institutional, it was spiritual. Ordinary believers began to doubt the legitimacy of the very system they were taught to trust. If bishops bought their mitres and abbots bought their monasteries, how could anyone believe that divine will was guiding the church? The disillusionment ran deep, and while the peasants may not have understood all the Latin sermons, they definitely noticed when the local priest started dressing like a baron and riding a horse finer than the village lords. Even within the church, simony caused chaos. True reformers, yes, they did exist, found themselves outnumbered and outmaneuvered by wealthy opportunists. Monastic orders tried to resist, but they often found themselves caught in the same system. Donations became bribes. Endowments came with strings. And before long, entire monasteries were staffed based on financial leverage, not vows. Papal elections were especially notorious. The College of Cardinals, rather than acting as a solemn body of holy men discerning the will of God, frequently devolved into a bidding war. Candidates for the papacy offered gifts, favors, and yes, bags of gold to secure the votes they needed. Sometimes these deals were made in whispers. Other times, the candidates made no attempt to hide it. After all, it wasn't bribery if everyone else was doing it too. And when someone did speak out, they were often met with polite silence or reassigned to a very cold, very distant post where they could reflect on the virtues of discretion. Meanwhile, the winners, those who paid their way to power, were under no illusions. They'd invested heavily to secure their position, and they expected returns. The papacy became a revolving door of nobles and political creatures who saw the Vatican as a revenue stream with incense. This wasn't just a Rome problem. Simony stretched across Europe, in France, in England, in the Holy Roman Empire. Wherever there were bishops to be named or abbeys to be filled, there were negotiations. The practice was so common that by the 11th century, it had become one of the major flashpoints in the struggle between popes and emperors. Enter the investiture controversy, a multi-decade tug-of-war between church and state over who had the right to appoint bishops. Was it the pope who claimed spiritual supremacy, or the emperor who claimed political necessity? Beneath all the theological arguments was a simple question: who gets to sell the bishopric? The pope wanted to say, no one. The emperor wanted to say, I do thank you. Both sides wore holy robes and righteous expressions. Both sides were also deeply entrenched in simony. The fallout from this controversy was immense. Popes like Gregory VII tried to stamp out simony with bold declarations, threats of excommunication, and the occasional spiritual temper tantrum. Some emperors responded with armies. Others with counterpopes, yes, anti-popes, were a thing. And they were often bought and paid for like limited edition action figures. Of course, not everyone in the church was thrilled about this. Reform movements sprang up, some from within, like the Cluniac and Cistercian monasteries, and others from the fiery fringes of theological patience. These groups preached a return to purity, humility, and a church free from financial entanglements. Many were ignored, a few were silenced, and eventually, one German monk named Martin Luther decided he'd had quite enough. But we're not there yet. What simony revealed, more than any doctrinal debate or excommunication drama, was that the medieval church was often more interested in revenue than righteousness. It operated not unlike a business empire, with branch managers, licensing fees, and quarterly projections disguised as tithes. Salvation became a commodity, and where grace should have been freely given, there was now a transaction, often handwritten, sealed, and notarized. By the time reformers tried to rein it in, the damage had been done. The faithful were jaded, the clergy were divided, and the papacy, once imagined as a beacon of divine guidance, looked more like a well-funded mess. Simony didn't just sell offices. It sold out the very ideals the church was meant to uphold. And in doing so, it set the stage for revolt reform and centuries of theological fallout. But before we get to the Lutherans, with their hammers and theses, we still have a few more popes to meet, ones who dabbled not just in corruption, but in family affairs that would make a Renaissance gossip columnist blush. If simony turned church offices into auction lots, the next chapter of papal scandal turned Rome itself into a dynastic stage, a swirl of ambition, family power plays, and political entanglements so convoluted that medieval chroniclers eventually just gave up and started calling the whole thing the pornocracy. That's not slang. That's the actual term historians use for this stretch of papal history. It means, quite literally, rule of the harlots. To be clear, no one was passing out commemorative mugs with "Welcome to the Pornocracy" as to 904 AD stamped on the side. But the phrase does capture the spirit of the era, a time when powerful Roman noblewomen, particularly one family, held the real reins of the church, while popes rotated through the office like background characters in a family soap opera. At the center of this whirlwind was Theophylact Count of Tusculum and his formidable wife, Theodora. But it was their daughter, Marozia, who became the true power behind the papal throne, literally. She wasn't a cardinal. She wasn't even technically part of the clergy. She was, however, cunning, politically savvy, and very good at arranging both marriages and papal elections. Marozia's influence was both personal and institutional. Her family controlled Rome's military and much of its wealth. More importantly, she understood how to install and remove popes. She was allegedly the lover of Pope Sergius III, who reigned from 904 to 911. If you're wondering whether this caused a stir, it did. Quite a bit. Especially since some sources claim they had a child together, a boy who would eventually become Pope John IV. Let's pause to take that in. We may have had a pope who was the son of another pope. That's a theological hairball the church never quite managed to cough up. Sergius III, for his part, didn't seem bothered. His reign is best remembered not for any great spiritual reform, but for cementing the power of the Theophylact clan in Roman politics. He turned the papacy into a family enterprise, which Marozia managed with the deftness of a mafia boss and the wardrobe of a noblewoman with very expensive taste. Marozia's grip on the church only grew stronger over time. She arranged for several popes to rise and fall according to the needs of the family. Her own son eventually became Pope John IV, reigning from 931 to 935, though his time in office was largely overshadowed by the fact that his mother was calling the shots. This period also saw the installation of Pope John X, another figure entangled in the family's network of favors and feuds. John X was once thought to have been Marozia's lover as well, though modern historians now debate that claim. What's not in dispute is that he met a rather grim fate, imprisoned and possibly murdered at the hands of Marozia's allies once he outlived his usefulness. The lines between spiritual leadership and political dominance had never been thinner. The papacy wasn't just corrupt, it was domestically micromanaged. The Lateran Palace might as well have been Marozia's family residence, with popes serving as rotating guests who either played their part or disappeared mysteriously into the Tiber River. By the time Marozia declared her son pope, it was no longer a surprise. What was surprising was how long this period of domination lasted. For decades, the Roman nobility, specifically the Theophylact family and their descendants, controlled papal elections, Vatican finances, and even church doctrine in some cases. They used the papacy to solidify alliances, reward loyalty, and crush opposition, all under the pretense of spiritual guidance. This was the true birth of what we might call dynastic popery, a term that sounds fictional but sadly isn't. The church had quite literally become a political fiefdom. And while some figures in this period may have held sincere beliefs, their ability to act on them was smothered by the realities of family politics. And yes, all of this happened in full view of the European nobility, who mostly shrugged and went back to their own local corruption. After all, if the Pope could hand his son the keys to St. Peter's Basilica, why shouldn't a duke hand his daughter the deed to a few thousand serfs? But not everyone was content to let the spectacle continue unchecked. Reformist monks in Cluny, France, were quietly observing and making notes. The Holy Roman emperors, especially the German ones, were growing increasingly annoyed that Rome had turned into a dynastic playground. And among the faithful murmurs of discontent began to spread. The pornocracy finally began to unravel after Marozia's fall from power, ironically at the hands of her own son from a later marriage. That son, Alberic II, seized control of Rome and imprisoned his mother, as one does. But even then the dynastic control didn't vanish. It simply shifted form. Alberic II made sure his own son would become pope, which he eventually did as Pope John the Stunted. And if that name sounds familiar, well, we already covered his adventurous tenure in Section 3. The cycle, as you may be noticing, had a very persistent rhythm. So why does this period matter? Because it shows that the rot didn't always come from theological confusion or external enemies. Sometimes it came from the inside, from families treating the church not as a spiritual institution, but as a convenient ladder to power. The pornocracy wasn't just a low point in papal history. It was the clearest signal that the church, for all its heavenly rhetoric, could be deeply, painfully human. And if you're thinking, this was the nadir, the absolute lowest point, rest assured, it gets weirder. Much weirder. Because next, we're going to meet a pope who decided that exhuming his dead rival and putting him on trial was a good use of church resources. Ah yes, the infamous Cadaver Synod. Just when you think the medieval papacy couldn't possibly become more surreal, we arrive at the point in church history where a sitting pope literally dug up his predecessor's corpse, dressed it in papal robes, sat it on a throne in court, and put it on trial. Not metaphorically, not in jest. This actually happened. Welcome to the late 9th century, when theology vendettas and really questionable courtroom decorum collided in one of history's most grotesque spectacles. Let's set the stage. The year is 897. Rome is in chaos. Again, Pope Stephen VI has recently taken office after a long string of short-lived and politically charged papal reigns. His predecessor, Pope Formosus, had been pope from 891 to 896 and had the unfortunate habit of making enemies, lots of them. The political scene in Italy at the time was an absolute mess, with rival claimants to the throne, fractious noble families, and the ever-meddling Frankish emperors all jostling for influence. Formosus got caught in the crossfire, siding with one faction and alienating another. So when Stephen VI became pope, he was pressured by Formosus's political enemies, particularly the supporters of Lambert of Spoleto, to deal with the inconvenient legacy of the late pope. And by deal with, they apparently meant drag out his corpse and scream at it. And thus, the Cadaver Synod was born. Stephen had Formosus's 9-month dead body exhumed from its grave in St. Peter's. Reports say it was in a state of fairly advanced decomposition, which you'd expect given the Roman climate and the lack of refrigeration. Nevertheless, the remains were dressed in full papal vestments and propped up in a chair inside the Lateran Basilica. And yes, Stephen did speak directly to the corpse. And yes, there was an actual deacon standing behind the body to answer questions on its behalf. This wasn't just symbolic. It was a full legal proceeding, complete with formal charges. Formosus was accused of violating church law by becoming pope while already being the bishop of another city, a valid concern back then of coveting the papacy. and most seriously, of illegitimately presiding over ecclesiastical appointments. Let's take a moment to appreciate the absurdity. Here, a corpse was being held, responsible for paperwork errors. Stephen, reportedly frothing with rage during the trial, shouted at the cadaver. Witnesses were horrified. Many saw it as sacrilege. Others, those with a sense of the dramatic, probably felt they'd gotten their money's worth. Unsurprisingly, the corpse lost the case. Stephen declared all of Formosis's acts as Pope invalid, including his ordinations. This created a theological mess, since dozens of bishops and clergy had received their positions from Formosus. If their ordinations were invalid, did that make their sacraments invalid too? Were baptisms unbaptized? Was the wine just? Wine. As punishment, the corpse was stripped of its vestments, had the fingers used for blessings cut off, and was then dumped into a pauper's grave. But the drama wasn't over. The body was dug up again, tied to weights, and thrown into the Tiber River. And here's where the story takes a turn that only the Middle Ages could deliver. Legend has it that the body washed up on shore, where miracles were reported at the site. People began to see Formosus as a martyr, and the tides of public opinion turned swiftly against Stephen VI. Riots erupted. Stephen was imprisoned by his enemies, and within months, strangled in his cell. That's right. The Pope who put a corpse on trial was himself taken down by mob justice. This entire arc has the pacing of a Greek tragedy if the Greeks had included more decomposing corpses and ecclesiastical finger-snipping. In the aftermath, Formosus was reburied in secret by sympathizers, and later popes declared the cadaver synod null and void. Some even tried to restore Formosus's reputation quietly, forgetting the whole dead pope in court thing, and hoping everyone would move on. Spoiler alert, they didn't. What's most revealing about the cadaver synod isn't just the morbid spectacle, it's what it says about the state of the church at the time. The papacy had become so politicized, so deeply embedded in factional warfare, that even in death, a pope could not rest. His corpse became a pawn in the ongoing game of power legitimacy and revenge. And Stephen VI, well, he wasn't the first pope to lose the plot, but he was certainly among the most theatrical. The cadaver synod became a cautionary tale for future pontiffs. Don't go too far, or the crowd might turn on you. And maybe, just maybe, leave the dead alone. But as we've already seen, and as we'll continue to see, the lesson didn't always stick. The papacy throughout the Middle Ages kept walking a fine line between the sacred and the absurd. And if putting a corpse on trial didn't end the madness, you can be sure something even stranger was waiting just around the corner. If dragging a rotting corpse into court wasn't bizarre enough for, you don't worry, the medieval papacy still had plenty of tricks up its embroidered sleeves. Because just when you think it couldn't get more theatrical, more brazen, or more tangled in power games, along comes the 11th century with a brand new kind of scandal, multiple rival popes. Not one, not two, sometimes three or more, all claiming the chair of St. Peter at once, all issuing decrees, all excommunicating each other. It was like watching a group project fall apart in Latin. Welcome to the era of the anti-pope. Now, what exactly is an anti-pope? Technically, it's someone who claims to be pope in opposition to the one officially recognized by the Roman Catholic Church. In practice, it was often a powerful noble's nephew, a scheming bishop, or a very ambitious monk backed by a regional warlord. When church politics met feudal ambition, the result was usually an anti-pope. And there were a lot of them, over 30, recognized by the church itself, depending on how strict your papal scorecard is. The 11th century saw a real boom in anti-popes, most of them springing from the toxic stew of politics, simony nepotism, and imperial meddling that we've already explored. One of the most chaotic episodes involved the investiture controversy, which we briefly touched on earlier. This was the centuries-long wrestling match between the papacy and the Holy Roman Emperors over who got to appoint bishops. On the surface, it was about theology. Underneath, it was about who held real power and who got to hand out the most desirable church offices to cousins and loyal barons. Pope Gregory VII, elected in 1073, was a reformer with a backbone made of forged steel and a temper to match. He was determined to cleanse the church of simony, enforce clerical celibacy, a wildly unpopular move among many clergy, and wrest control of appointments back from secular rulers. It was a noble mission until it collided headfirst with Emperor Henry IV. The two men hated each other almost instantly. Gregory excommunicated Henry not once but twice, which in medieval terms was basically the spiritual equivalent of launching a holy nuke. Henry responded by marching to Rome and installing his own pope, Clement III. And just like that, Christendom had two popes. This wasn't a quiet disagreement. Gregory VII was holed up in the Castel Sant'Angelo, pleading for help. Henry IV was camped outside with an army. Eventually, Gregory had to flee, dying in exile. Clement III ruled in his place, but not without resistance from Gregory's supporters. For decades afterward, the church was divided between reformers and imperial loyalists, each with their own pope, each claiming to be the real one, and each treating the other's decrees like spam mail from a rival bishop. The ordinary faithful absolutely bewildered. Imagine living in a small village where you go to Mass only to hear the local priest refer to Pope Clement. Then you travel 2 towns over and they're praying for Pope Gregory. Both churches claim the other is heretical. Meanwhile, you're just trying to get your baby baptized without stepping into a schism. The anti-pope issue wasn't confined to Germany and Italy. France, Spain, and even England occasionally got involved, backing different claimants depending on their political alliances. Some anti-popes had massive followings and even controlled Rome for a time. Others were flash-in-the-pan contenders who reigned from castles' abbeys, or occasionally someone's very large basement. The chaos reached a fever pitch in the 14th century with the Western Schism. But even before then, the concept of a stable singular papacy was slipping. The office had become so politicized, so wrapped up in noble ambitions, that any serious disagreement now had a built-in solution. Just elect a different pope and hope for the best. Of course, being an anti-pope wasn't all incense and tiaras. It came with real risks. Many ended up deposed, excommunicated, or imprisoned. Some were quietly poisoned. Others were paraded through the streets in shame. Still, the allure of the papacy, its wealth, prestige, and influence was enough to keep contenders lining up like children at a feast day fair. And again, this wasn't happening in secret. The spectacle was public. Cardinals fled from city to city. Crowds rioted. Imperial armies loomed. And throughout it all, church governance faltered. Decisions were delayed or ignored. Reforms stalled. and trust in the papal office plummeted. It's important to understand that many of these men, both popes and anti-popes, weren't cartoon villains. Some were sincere believers. Some were brilliant administrators or scholars. But the system they operated in was deeply broken, a tangled web of spiritual authority and raw political muscle. The result, a century where even the question, who is the Pope, had no clear answer. Eventually, the Church would try to clean up the mess. Councils would be called. Lines would be drawn. But in the 11th century, the problem of rival popes wasn't an embarrassing footnote. It was the main storyline. And if you thought multiple popes fighting each other was the height of dysfunction, just wait. Soon, we'll meet popes who plunged headfirst into military campaigns, who raised armies, fought wars, and marched under banners of gold. Because nothing says Vicar of Christ like charging into battle wearing a helmet over your mitre. At some point in the Middle Ages, the papacy took a hard left turn from spiritual shepherding to something more like tactical command. Popes were no longer content to sit in Rome and issue decrees. They wanted armies, banners, castles, and in several impressive cases, full-blown battle strategies. If the earlier centuries gave us popes embroiled in vice and nepotism, the 12th and 13th centuries gave us popes in chainmail, leading troops, and blessing swords like a spiritual blacksmith. Let's start with Pope Leo IX. Elected in 1049, Leo was a reformer, a diplomat, and when necessary, a general. His papacy coincided with the rise of the Normans in southern Italy, who were causing all sorts of headaches for the Byzantines and the papal territories. Leo decided to take matters into his own hands, literally. He personally led an army against the Normans in 1053. It did not go well. The Pope's forces were defeated at the Battle of Civitate, and Leo himself was captured. Yes, the Pope captured by Normans. He was held for 9 months before being released, an event that forced the Church to rethink whether maybe generals and pontiffs should be separate jobs. But Leo was just the warm-up act. Pope Urban II, elected in 1088, took the idea of military popery and catapulted it into global significance. In 1095, at the Council of Clermont, he gave a fiery speech urging Christian knights to take up arms and liberate the Holy Land from Muslim control. The result, the First Crusade. Urban's message spread like wildfire. His call for a holy war wasn't just a theological directive. It was an early example of mass mobilization. Pilgrims and knights alike swarmed eastward, bearing crosses on their cloaks and a heavy sense of divine mission. The success of the First Crusade, at least by the medieval standards of conquest and carnage, cemented Urban's legacy as a pope who didn't just bless swords. He ordered them into action. The Crusades transformed the role of the papacy. No longer was the Pope merely a spiritual father. He became a war leader, a kingmaker, and a geopolitical force. His letters were treated like battle plans. His support could determine the fate of kingdoms. And while the moral implications were, shall we say, murky, the effect was clear. The Church was no longer above the battlefield. It was in the thick of it. Future popes followed suit. Innocent III, arguably the most powerful medieval pope, organized the Fourth Crusade, which, if you're wondering, famously never made it to the Holy Land. Instead, the Crusaders sacked Constantinople in 1204, a Christian city. That's right. They attacked fellow Christians in the name of Christian unity. It was not innocence' finest hour, but it certainly illustrated how tangled papal ambitions had become. He also launched the Albigensian Crusade against the Cathars in southern France, a domestic cleansing campaign that blurred the line between heresy hunting and genocide. Entire towns were wiped out. One papal legate, when asked how to distinguish heretics from faithful Catholics during a siege, allegedly said, "Kill them all. God will know his own." It's a quote so chilling, it practically echoes. Then there was Pope Julius II, who came much later in the early 1500s, but deserves an honorary mention here for fully embracing the warrior pope archetype. Nicknamed the Warrior Pope Julius, rode into battle in full armor and personally oversaw military campaigns in Italy. He carried a sword more often than a sermon, and he wore his helmet with just as much pride as his tiara, and still Julius wasn't seen as abnormal. In fact, he was celebrated by many for reclaiming papal authority and asserting independence from secular rulers. His vision of the papacy was militant, aggressive, and thoroughly political. The Vatican under Julius wasn't a sanctuary, it was a command center. Of course, not every pope was thrilled about this militarization. Some quietly resisted it. Others focused on diplomacy, education, and internal reform. But the prevailing trend was clear. If you were pope in the Middle Ages, people expected you to be more than just holy. You had to be strong, you had to be feared, and that fear extended beyond the battlefield. Popes issued interdicts that closed entire kingdoms' churches. They excommunicated emperors, shut down trade, and turned sacraments into bargaining chips. The sword and the crozier were now twin tools of the same office. For the faithful, this presented a confusing picture. Was the Pope a shepherd or a soldier, a healer or a hammer? The contrast between Christ's teachings and the actions of his vicar had never been more stark. Yet still, the institution held. The church adapted. The papacy remained powerful, partly because no one wanted to be on the wrong end of a pope with an army. So if you're picturing the medieval papacy as a peaceful council of scholars in flowing robes, adjust your mental image. Add some armor, maybe a horse or two. Definitely a battle banner bearing the keys of Peter, and a motto like faith and fire. Because in this era, the Pope didn't just lead prayers, he led charges. And coming up next, we'll step into the velvet-draped halls of Renaissance Rome, where popes dined like kings, plotted like dukes, and occasionally threw parties that made pagan Rome look like a silent retreat. By the time we hit the 15th and 16th centuries, the papacy had undergone a dramatic costume change, trading in the dust of crusader camps for velvet slippers, golden goblets, and parties that could give Versailles a run for its money. Welcome to the Renaissance Popes, a collection of men who painted, schemed, seduced, feasted, and funded Michelangelo's ceiling, while occasionally remembering they were supposed to be running the church. If earlier popes had shocked people by raising armies or selling offices, the Renaissance popes shocked by how openly they indulged in the worldly pleasures their vows said they should renounce. But this was a new age, and Rome, oh Rome, was once again the center of the world. Wealth poured in from tithes, taxes, and art commissions. The Vatican became a palace, then an empire, and finally, depending on who you asked, a kind of ecclesiastical theme park, where the sacred and the scandalous sat down to dinner together. Let's begin with Pope Sixtus IV, who reigned from 1471 to 1484. Sixtus was, by all accounts, a savvy administrator, and the kind of man who could balance a budget, erect a basilica, and still find time to promote half his family to cardinalships. You might know him best as the Pope who commissioned the Sistine Chapel, which is admittedly an impressive entry on any resume. But Sixtus's motivations weren't entirely spiritual. He saw art as propaganda, as a way to glorify the papacy and conveniently immortalize his legacy in fresco. But he also embroiled himself in the Pazzi conspiracy, a failed plot to assassinate Lorenzo de' Medici and his brother Giuliano during Easter Mass in Florence. Yes, the Pope got tangled up in an attempted church murder, because Renaissance politics was spicy like that. Next comes Pope Alexander VI, born Rodrigo Borgia, the most notorious of them all. If the papacy were a soap opera, Alexander would be the shirtless villain with dramatic lighting and a flute of wine. His papacy from 1492 to 1503 was drenched in luxury intrigue and more than a little family drama. Rodrigo Borgia had several children openly before and during his papacy. His son Cesare Borgia was made cardinal at 18 later, turned warlord, and became the dark inspiration for Machiavelli's The Prince. His daughter, Lucrezia Borgia, depending on which chroniclers you believe, was either a pawn in her father's political games or a poison-dispensing femme fatale with a jewelry box full of secrets. Under Alexander VI, the Vatican was transformed into a Renaissance court of scandal. Lavish feasts, mistresses in the papal apartments, bribery, open simony. It all happened, and mostly without apology. One banquet, known ominously as the Banquet of Chestnuts, reportedly involved courtesans dancing nude in the Apostolic Palace, with prizes awarded for dexterity. Whether the stories were embellished or not, the fact that they were plausible says enough. But Alexander wasn't just scandalous, he was effective. He played European politics like a chess master. He expanded papal territory through strategic alliances and brutal military campaigns. He controlled the College of Cardinals with payoffs and promotions. His enemies feared him, his allies owed him, and his family grew rich. He wasn't running a church, he was running a dynasty, and yet he still had time for patronage. He funded architecture, supported the arts, and helped shape Rome into the city we know today. It's a confusing legacy, spiritual corruption intertwined with cultural brilliance. A man who may have poisoned rivals by day and sponsored churches by night. Following Alexander came Pope Julius II, whom we met earlier in his armored furs. But Julius wasn't just a warrior. He was also a patron of immense importance. He commissioned Michelangelo to paint the Sistine Chapel ceiling, even though Michelangelo was primarily a sculptor and absolutely did not want the job. But when the Pope insists, and he's armed, you paint. Then we reach Pope Leo X, a Medici, because of course. Leo reigned from 1513 to 1521 and famously said, upon ascending to the throne, "Let us enjoy the papacy since God has given it to us." And enjoy it he did. Leo loved theater music banquets, exotic animals, and oddly enough, parading a mechanical elephant through the Vatican gardens. Because what is divine authority without a wind-up pachyderm? Under Leo indulgences, those paid-for spiritual get-out-of-purgatory free cards reached their peak. The money poured in funding more art, more festivities, and a very expensive lifestyle. But all this lavishness, all this velvet and gold came with a cost. A German monk named Martin Luther watched the spectacle from afar and began asking questions. Leo dismissed Luther as a minor nuisance. He did not realize he was lighting the fuse for the Protestant Reformation. By this point, the Renaissance popes had created a church bursting with contradictions, stunning cathedrals, and debased politics, transcendent art, and spiritual emptiness. The same pope who commissioned Raphael might also host a mistress's wedding in the papal chambers, a sermon in the morning, a masked ball by night. The holiness was real, but so was the decadence. For the people of Europe, it created cognitive whiplash. They were told to tithe for the souls of their dead, while their offerings funded tapestries and feasts. They were warned about the fires of damnation, while the clergy dined under frescoed ceilings depicting heaven itself. And for many, it was too much. So while the Renaissance gave us beauty, innovation, and artistic genius, it also gave us a church that had in many ways lost its moral compass. The papacy had become a court of kings, sometimes wise, often wicked, rarely humble, and the Reformation just over the horizon. But we're not done with the drama yet, because before Luther's hammer hit the church door, there was still time for one final act of papal theater, the Great Western Schism, when multiple popes simultaneously claimed to be the one true pontiff again. But this time it came with full bureaucratic chaos and a council that tried to fire all of them. If you thought the era of anti-popes was confusing enough, buckle up, because the Great Western Schism took all the drama of dueling popes and cranked it up to maximum absurdity, splitting the church not just in two, but eventually in three, with multiple claimants to the papal throne at once, each excommunicating the others, each with their own loyal courts, and all insisting they were the real pope. It was less one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church, and more of a theological soap opera with really nice vestments. Let's rewind to the 14th century. After centuries of chaos and corruption in Rome, the papacy had settled briefly into a kind of weary routine. But in 1309, Pope Clement V, a Frenchman, decided Rome was a little too unstable, a little too plaguey, and far too murdery for comfort. So he moved the papal court to Avignon in southern France. And there it stayed for nearly 70 years. This period is often called the Avignon Papacy, or depending on how dramatic you're feeling, the Babylonian captivity of the church. Why that name? Because critics compared it to the biblical exile of the Israelites, painting the image of a church enslaved by French interests. And there was truth to it. 7 successive popes during this time were French, and their policies often aligned with French royal priorities. The Vatican became a kind of deluxe French chateau, complete with expensive tapestries, vineyards, and cardinals, who, let's say, enjoyed the comforts of court life. Rome, meanwhile, fell into disrepair. The Lateran palace crumbled. The Roman populace became restless. And eventually, the call to bring the papacy back to the Eternal City grew too loud to ignore. So in 1377, Pope Gregory IV packed up and returned to Rome, only to die shortly afterward. His death sparked what was supposed to be a routine papal election. Instead, it ignited one of the most bizarre and damaging crises in church history. The Roman people demanded an Italian pope, having grown tired of French dominance. Under that pressure, the cardinals elected Urban VI, an Italian with strong opinions and very little chill. At first, the cardinals probably felt they had made a solid choice. Then Urban started yelling a lot. He harshly criticized the luxurious lifestyles of the cardinals. He tried to eliminate nepotism. He suggested reforms. All good ideas, just delivered with the subtlety of a brick through stained glass. The cardinals, who were used to the relaxed Avignon style of pontificate, were not amused. Soon they declared that the election had been made under duress because of the Roman mob, and thus invalid. They fled to Anagni, and there they elected a new pope, Clement VII, who promptly returned to Avignon. And just like that, there were two popes. Urban VI held Rome. Clement VII held Avignon. Each claimed to be the rightful successor of Saint Peter. Each declared the other a usurper and issued excommunications like party favors. And worse yet, the Christian world had to choose sides. France, Scotland, Aragon, Castile, and Naples supported Clement in Avignon. England, the Holy Roman Empire, and much of Northern Europe sided with Urban in Rome. The map of papal loyalty looked like a checkerboard. Local priests were now in the awkward position of having to decide which pope's name to mention during Mass, choose wrong, and you could be accused of heresy. Or worse, taxed by the wrong pope and excommunicated twice before breakfast. This situation, which no one expected to last, dragged on for decades. After Urban and Clement died, each faction elected successors, continuing the schism. It became an institutional nightmare. Church governance broke down. Theological arguments turned circular. And the faithful were increasingly disillusioned. After all, if both popes were claiming divine authority, and yet both were condemning each other to hell, who was actually in charge? The papacy's moral authority plummeted. And so, in a rare burst of collective crisis management, a council was convened to fix things. In 1409, the Council of Pisa met to resolve the schism once and for all. Their brilliant plan: depose both popes and elect a new one. And that's what they did. They declared both the Roman Pope, Gregory XII, and the Avignon Pope, Benedict III, illegitimate, and elected a third, Alexander IV. Problem solved. Not exactly. Neither Gregory nor Benedict agreed to step down. So now, instead of two popes, the church had three. Three papal courts. Three sets of bulls and decrees. Three groups of bishops sending very nervous letters to each other. The absurdity was complete. Eventually, in 1414, the church held the Council of Constance, a much more effective and better attended gathering. Over several years of negotiation diplomacy and the occasional subtle threat, the council managed to convince Gregory XII, the Roman Pope, to resign voluntarily. They deposed Benedict XIII, who refused to cooperate and ignored the Pisan line entirely. In 1417, they elected Pope Martin IV, who was broadly accepted by all sides. At last, after 39 years, the schism was over. But the damage lingered. The Great Western Schism had exposed the deep cracks in the church's foundations. It had shown that papal legitimacy could be questioned, papal elections could be manipulated, and the unity of Christendom could be fractured by politics just as easily as by theology. It also emboldened secular rulers who realized they could play popes against each other to extract favors. And it gave reformers, especially those watching from Germany and Bohemia, plenty of ammunition for the storms to come. Still, for the moment, the papacy was once again whole. One pope, one Rome, one increasingly creaky institution in desperate need of reform. And wouldn't you know it, right around the corner is a monk with a hammer, a door, and 95 things to say about all this. So here we are, the early 16th century. The dust from the Great Western Schism has barely settled. The Vatican has just about reassembled itself into something resembling unity. But the walls are thin, the foundation shaky, and the ceiling well. Michelangelo is still up there painting. The Renaissance has bloomed, the printing press is humming, and people are beginning to ask uncomfortable questions. Especially one German monk with a regrettably strong sense of conscience. Enter Martin Luther. But first, let's rewind just a bit. The Reformation didn't explode from nowhere. It was the culmination of centuries of simmering discontent. We've already seen how the papacy had become bloated with power, wealth, and scandal. How indulgences were sold like raffle tickets. How simony and nepotism rotted the institution from within. The people weren't blind. They watched priests live in luxury while preaching poverty. They watched cardinals conduct mass with one hand and count coin with the other. And in this context, Pope Leo III, the Medici Pope, we met back in section 12, decided to fund the grand reconstruction of St. Peter's Basilica. It was a project of staggering ambition and cost. To pay for it, the church leaned heavily on the sale of indulgences, those convenient little slips of parchment promising the remission of sins in exchange for cash. It had become a system so brazen that the Dominican friar Johann Tetzel was sent around German territories, practically shouting, "As soon as the coin in the coffer brings the soul from purgatory springs." This did not sit well with Luther. In 1517, Luther nailed his 95 theses to the door of the Wittenberg Castle Church. They weren't meant to start a revolution, just a discussion. But with the printing press on his side, his critique spread like wildfire. His main point: the Pope had no authority over purgatory, and salvation could not be bought or sold. A bold claim, a necessary one. The papacy, predictably, was not thrilled. Pope Leo X saw Luther not as a spiritual threat, but as a pesky academic with an attitude problem. In 1520, he issued a papal bull, Exsurge Domine, demanding that Luther recant or face excommunication. Luther responded by burning the bull in public, and so began the most seismic schism in Western Christianity since the days of the Roman Empire. But this wasn't just about Luther. The Reformation caught fire across Europe because so many were already disillusioned. It wasn't one man yelling at Rome. It was a chorus of voices that had been muffled for too long. Reformers in Switzerland, England, and Scandinavia soon followed. New denominations arose. Churches were stripped of relics. Monasteries were dissolved. The map of Christendom fractured permanently, and the papacy, it stumbled. Leo X died in 1521, having reportedly said on his deathbed, "It has served us well, this myth of Christ." Whether apocryphal or not, the quote captured the cynicism many felt at the time. The papacy was seen less as a beacon of faith and more as a political machine draped in silk. His successors struggled to contain the fallout. Pope Adrian VI, a rare non-Italian, tried to push genuine reform, but he lasted only a year. Pope Clement VI, back to Medici bloodlines, was far more concerned with diplomacy than doctrine, and under his watch, Rome was sacked in 1527 by troops loyal to the Holy Roman Emperor. That's right. The eternal city home of Peter was looted and defiled. Cardinals fled, churches were desecrated, and Clement hid in Castel Sant'Angelo while Rome burned. If it sounds like a divine judgment, well, plenty of people at the time thought the same. Clement's reign was a disaster diplomatically and spiritually. He failed to stop the spread of Protestantism, alienated allies, and oversaw one of the most humiliating chapters in Vatican history. By the end of his tenure, the papacy was no longer the unquestioned spiritual ruler of Europe. It was one of several competing voices in a noisy, volatile religious world. The Counter-Reformation would eventually come spearheaded by later popes and bolstered by the newly formed Jesuits. But by then, the landscape had changed forever. The Pope was still powerful, but not omnipotent. He now had to contend with Protestant monarchs, secular republics, and a rapidly expanding public sphere where ideas were harder to suppress. And yet, even as it lost spiritual monopoly, the papacy did not lose its flair for scandal. Pope Paul III, who reigned from 1534 to 1549, tried to clean house, convening the Council of Trent and pushing for reform. But he also appointed 2 teenage grandsons as cardinals. Yes, teenagers. And by then, nobody was even surprised. Because if there's one thing the medieval and Renaissance papacy teaches us, it's that the line between sacred and profane, between holy authority and human failing, is one the Church has danced along for centuries. At times, gracefully. At times, well, not. The Reformation had cracked the facade. The scandals had laid the foundation. And while the next centuries would bring more councils, reforms and papal politics, the golden aura surrounding the office would never fully return. Still, the papacy endured. Because history, like faith, has a way of surviving even its own worst moments. And up next, we'll meet the popes who tried to clean the mess with varying degrees of success. Reformers, architects, and a few more who couldn't quite resist the siren call of gold glory and grape-stained vestments. After the thunderclap of the Reformation and the bruising humiliation of Rome's sack in 1527, you might think the popes would go full monk mode, ashes, sackcloth, barefoot, walks through cloisters. Not quite. What followed instead was a curious blend of sincere reform, political recalibration, and in some cases, an even more intense flair for theatrical displays of papal majesty. The papacy didn't so much retreat as it reinvented itself with incense Latin thunder and a few well-placed marble sculptures. Let's start with Pope Paul III, who reigned from 1534 to 1549. He's one of the more complex figures in church history, a man with a mistress and multiple children, but also a genuine desire to fix the mess Rome had become. If contradiction were a sacrament, Paul would have been canonized on day one. Paul III is best known for launching the Council of Trent in 1545, which would become the centerpiece of the Counter-Reformation. This council tackled everything the Church had either ignored or actively worsened for centuries: indulgences, clerical corruption, the education of priests, and the role of scripture and tradition. It was serious business, and it stretched over 18 years under 3 different popes. Because sometimes reform takes a while, especially when you do it in Latin. The council reaffirmed Catholic doctrine while promising to clean up abuses. It didn't budge much on theology. There was no sudden embrace of sola fide. but it did set out to make sure future bishops weren't also managing brothels or gambling away monastery roofs. Small victories. Paul also gave his backing to a group that would become central to the church's revival, the Society of Jesus, or Jesuits. Founded by Ignatius of Loyola, these were intellectuals in cassocks, combining military discipline, razor-sharp theology, and a willingness to go anywhere from the courts of Chinese emperors to the Amazon jungle in defense of Catholicism. If the Protestants had printing presses, the Jesuits had schools, universities, and the kind of energy that makes caffeine nervous. Paul III, for all his contradictions, laid the groundwork for a reformed church, just one still perched atop Renaissance marble and powered by dynastic priorities. For instance, he made two of his grandsons cardinals. One was 16, the other age 14. Because apparently, family loyalty is a tradition stronger than celibacy. Next came Pope Julius III, whose pontificate 1550-1555 proved that the papacy hadn't entirely turned a new leaf. Julius is best remembered not for his theological reforms, but for elevating his teenage adopted nephew to cardinal, and depending on which historian you ask, showering him with unusually affectionate attention. The Vatican at this time still had moments that made people wonder whether the Reformation had really hit hard enough. Fortunately, popes like Pius IV and Pius XII brought a sterner, more sober tone to the office. Pius V in particular was the real deal. A former inquisitor who dressed in a simple white robe, starting the tradition of papal white, walked barefoot during Lent, and genuinely believed in enforcing discipline. He excommunicated Queen Elizabeth I of England, which was bold, though not especially effective, as England responded by doubling down on its Protestant identity. Still, Pius V embodied the austere moralistic tone that the Council of Trent had envisioned. Under his watch, the church cleaned house, no more open simony, no more cardinals with 15 villas, no more feasts where the fish course was carried in by dancing boys, at least not in public. Then came Sixtus V, the Pope, who made Roman infrastructure his personal crusade. He ruled from 1585 to 1590 and built aqueducts, repaired churches, straightened roads, and perhaps most famously, put up way too many obelisks. He even planned to turn the Colosseum into a wool factory. You've got to admire the optimism. Sixtus was also the kind of man who kept a list of cardinals he planned to purge. Not metaphorically, an actual list. He centralized power in the papacy in a way no one had since Innocent III, creating Vatican institutions that still exist today. Sixtus wasn't interested in banquets. He wanted efficiency and executions, mostly executions. And yet, even amid all this reform, contradictions lingered. Popes were still chosen largely through behind-the-scenes alliances. National interests still played an outsized role, and papal nepotism alive and well. The only thing that changed was that it now wore cleaner robes and delivered sermons with sharper Latin. Still, the church was undeniably stronger. By the end of the 16th century, it had clawed back much of its lost prestige. Protestantism had spread, yes, but Catholicism had solidified. It had a global missionary presence, a tighter bureaucracy, and a new image of papal authority that blended spiritual rigor with Renaissance aesthetics. This new papacy was cleaner, stricter, and less obviously scandalous. But the grandeur never really left. Popes still commissioned art, hosted dignitaries, and sat on golden thrones while preaching humility. Old habits die hard. So as the sun set on the Counter-Reformation, the papacy had for the most part regained control of its image. It had weathered schism, war, corruption, and reformation, and emerged with marble floors polished and banners flying. But underneath the polish, some of the old flaws remained waiting patiently for another crack in the surface. And in the coming centuries, there would be cracks, sometimes even earthquakes. But for now, the popes were enjoying something rare in church history, a moment of relative peace. No cadaver trials, no rival claimants, just a lot of incense Latin choirs and the faint smell of fresco paint still drying. By the 17th century, the papacy had settled into a strange new groove, outwardly serene, richly ornamented, and internally obsessed with balance between power and piety, reform and tradition, splendor and sobriety. The worst of the medieval chaos was gone. The Protestant threat had been cordoned off into Northern Europe, and the Vatican was doing what it does best, constructing marble staircases to heaven, while micromanaging the fine points of Latin theology. But scandal, as always, never vanished. It merely changed costumes. Let's begin with Pope Urban VIII, who reigned from 1623 to 1644. Urban was a product of the Barberini family, an ambitious Roman clan with a fondness for bees. Their family crest had 3 of them, and a deeper fondness for power. Urban loved art, science, poetry, and above all his family, which is why nearly every position of influence in Rome during his pontificate somehow ended up in Barberini hands. Urban's nepotism was so blatant that it sparked the bitter Roman saying, "What the barbarians didn't do, the Barberini did." A reference to the fact that the city's ancient monuments were being stripped to fund Urban's projects. He even had bronze removed from the Pantheon to make cannons and decorations for St. Peter's Basilica. So much for preservation. Still, Urban wasn't without accomplishments. He pushed for missionary work, supported the arts, and helped elevate the church's global profile. But his papacy also saw one of the most infamous episodes in scientific history, the trial of Galileo Galilei. Urban had once been friendly with Galileo. In fact, Galileo dedicated his book, Dialogue Concerning the Two Chief World Systems, to the Pope himself. But when the book portrayed the Pope's arguments thinly disguised in the mouth of a bumbling character named Simplicio as, well, simple-minded things turned icy, very icy. In 1633, Galileo was tried by the Inquisition and found vehemently suspect of heresy. He was forced to recant his support of heliocentrism and lived under house arrest for the rest of his life. The church's reputation took a hit that still echoes in science classrooms today. Urban's papacy then was emblematic of this era, brilliant, cultured, and politically ruthless. He advanced learning while suppressing dissent. He beautified Rome while training its scoffers. And when he died, his successor, Pope Innocent X, launched investigations into the Barberinis' financial shenanigans, forcing them to flee to France. Speaking of Innocent X, his reign, 1644-1658, was equally complex. He fought bitterly with cardinals, resented the Barberini influence, and famously had a painting of himself done by Diego Velázquez that makes him look like he's judging your soul and finding it lacking. He also ruled during the Peace of Westphalia, which ended the 30 Years' War, but left the Pope politically sidelined. The peace treaties for the first time were negotiated without papal input, an ominous sign of things to come. Throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, popes increasingly found themselves trying to keep up with a world that was no longer afraid of them. Monarchs grew bolder, national churches strengthened, philosophers began whispering questions that would become shouts in the Enlightenment. Yet still the papacy carried on. Pope Alexander VII, 1655 to 1667, loved architecture and tried to restore some spiritual dignity to the Vatican. His papacy oversaw the completion of Bernini's colonnade in St. Peter's Square, a triumph of symmetry and welcome. He also opposed nepotism, in theory. In practice, 5 of his relatives got cushy Vatican jobs, old habits. Then came Pope Clement, Ischin 1700-1721, who had the misfortune of serving during the early Enlightenment, a time when thinkers across Europe were poking holes in papal authority with the sharp stick of reason. Clement issued bans on books, condemned doctrines, and tried to keep control. But the tide was turning. It was hard to argue for divine right when telescopes, encyclopedias, and microscopes were being invented weekly. One particular scandal involved Clement's Chinese rites controversy. Jesuit missionaries in China had been adapting Christian teachings to local customs, allowing converts to honor Confucius and their ancestors as part of cultural tradition. It worked beautifully until Rome stepped in. Clement ruled that such practices were idolatrous, which alienated Chinese emperors and halted Catholic expansion in the region. The verdict didn't just damage the mission, it also exposed how out of touch the papacy could be with cultural nuance and diplomacy. By now you might notice a pattern. The medieval popes were plagued by open corruption and military entanglements. The Renaissance popes threw lavish parties while selling salvation like souvenirs. But the Baroque and Enlightenment popes, their sins were subtler bureaucracy, overreach, diplomatic blunders, intellectual inflexibility. Yet even amid the swirling debates and diplomatic scuffles, the visual majesty of the papacy reached new heights. St. Peter's gleamed like never before. Rome was a city of fountains, piazzas, and domes, each one a monument to the paradox of papal power. Stunning on the outside, increasingly unstable underneath, the church had survived schism, invasion, and reform. But it was about to face a new kind of revolution, one that would shake every throne in Europe, including the one made of gold and velvet in the Apostolic Palace, because coming over the Alps was the age of reason, and with it, a short Corsican general who had no time for tiaras treaties, or the infallibility of any man who didn't command an army. Yes, we're talking about the French Revolution, the Napoleonic whirlwind, and a papacy that suddenly found itself imprisoned, humiliated, and wondering whether it still had a future. When the Enlightenment finally broke over Europe, like a dawn that refused to shut up the papacy, long accustomed to being the one asking the questions, suddenly found itself being questioned relentlessly. Philosophers, pamphleteers, and powder-wigged revolutionaries weren't asking how to kiss the Pope's ring anymore. They were asking why a man in a palace, wearing a jewel-encrusted hat, got to claim divine authority over kings' countries and the curvature of the earth. Things got especially spicy in France. The French Revolution, which erupted in 1789, was many things: a class rebellion, a war on monarchy, a very enthusiastic use of guillotines, but it was also a direct assault on on the Catholic Church's political and financial power. France had long been a Catholic stronghold, but now, with liberty, equality, and fraternity marching in the streets, bishops were being driven out, cathedrals repurposed, and statues of saints replaced by busts of Voltaire. It was not a good time to be wearing clerical robes. And then came Napoleon Bonaparte, the short man with tall ambitions. By the late 1790s, he had clawed his way to power in post-revolutionary France. And while he wasn't exactly pious, Napoleon understood the value of a good public blessing. So he invited Pope Pius VII to crown him emperor in 1804, hoping to add a bit of divine sparkle to the coronation. Pius VII, eager to restore relations with France after the horrors of the revolution, agreed. He traveled to Paris, endured the pomp, and stepped up to perform the sacred rite, only for Napoleon to snatch the crown out of the Pope's hands and place it on his own head, a not-so-subtle message. Thanks, Holiness. I'll take it from here. That moment perfectly captured the new relationship between church and state. The papacy was still respected, still symbolically powerful, but the balance of real power had shifted. Napoleon was emperor by his own authority. The Pope was at best a guest at the party. It didn't get better. In 1809, after relations soured, Napoleon annexed the Papal States and arrested Pope Pius VII, dragging him off to France, where he was kept in captivity for several years. Imagine it, the successor of St. Peter, imprisoned by a general who once sold snowballs as a side hustle. It was humiliation on a grand empire-wide scale, but Pius VII proved surprisingly resilient. When Napoleon finally fell in 1814, the Pope was released and triumphantly returned to Rome. It was the sort of comeback story the papacy loves. And in fairness, Pius handled it with more grace than most of his predecessors would have. No revenge lists, no excommunications, just a quiet restoration of the Vatican's authority and a slow return to papal normalcy. But normal had changed. Europe had been forever altered. The old union of altar and throne was breaking apart. Secular governments were on the rise. The church was increasingly seen as a moral authority, not a political one. In many countries, the Pope had no say in state affairs and no army to enforce his will. This loss of temporal power became even more pronounced during the 19th century. Italy itself, yes, the very peninsula that housed the Pope, began unifying into a modern nation-state led by figures like Giuseppe Garibaldi and Count Cavour. Their goal, a unified Italy, free from foreign rule and from papal interference. That meant trouble. For the Papal States, a collection of territories in central Italy ruled directly by the Pope. By 1870, with Rome under siege and the Pope refusing to budge, Italian forces marched in and claimed the city. The Papal States were no more. Just like that, the Pope was stripped of his last worldly kingdom. Pope Pius IX, who had once been seen as a liberal reformer, responded by barricading himself inside the Vatican and declaring himself a prisoner of the Vatican. He refused to recognize the legitimacy of the Italian state, and for decades, the popes would not set foot outside the Vatican walls. Ironically, Pius IX also presided over one of the most theologically ambitious papal declarations of the modern era, papal infallibility. At the First Vatican Council in 1870, the doctrine was formally defined. It stated that under very specific conditions, when the Pope speaks ex cathedra, from the chair of St. Peter, on matters of faith or morals, he is preserved from the possibility of error. In other words, Just as the Pope lost his armies and lands, he gained divine immunity in the realm of doctrine, a spiritual crown to replace the political one. This moment marked a profound shift. The Pope was no longer a king among kings. He was now more fully a religious figure, global in reach, but spiritual in focus. Gone were the days of marching with armies or issuing bulls that toppled monarchs. What remained was the moral voice of the Church, echoing from behind the high walls of the Vatican. The scandal now was not in overt corruption or theatrical decadence. It was in the very tension between relevance and irrelevance. Could the Pope still command attention in a world of secular constitutions, steam engines, and socialist manifestos? Was the Church still the soul of Europe, or just an echo from its medieval past? These were the questions the papacy would have to face in the coming century. A century that would bring 2 world wars, a Cold War, and the most radical reforms the Church had seen in 500 years. But first, the popes had to learn how to live without a kingdom, without armies, without the threat of excommunication shaping borders. And that meant adjusting to a very different kind of scandal, one where silence, hesitation, and inaction spoke louder than bulls and bannings ever could. By the late 19th century, the Pope was no longer a warlord, no longer a landowner in the traditional sense, and definitely no longer a man with an army at his disposal. The Pope had become quite literally a prisoner inside the Vatican walls, thanks to the unification of Italy and the loss of the Papal States. But if you thought this would usher in an era of contemplative peace and quiet reflection, well, you're clearly new here. Because even with the doors closed and the Swiss Guard the only soldiers left, the papacy never quite shed its talent for controversy. Now the battlegrounds were spiritual, ideological, and increasingly international. Pope Pius IX, who ruled for a staggering 31 years, 1846 to 1878, had the dubious honor of being both the last pope to rule over a kingdom and the first to proclaim the doctrine of papal infallibility. And yes, in case you're wondering, the idea that the Pope can never be wrong under specific doctrinal circumstances was and remains controversial, even among Catholics. Some saw it as a necessary clarification of papal authority in a time of growing secularism. Others saw it as a papal power grab, dressed in theological robes. Pius IX also released the Syllabus of Errors, a list of things the Pope officially condemned, including rationalism, socialism, modern democracy, and the idea that the Church should not have a say in public education. It was like the papal version of yelling, "Get off my lawn," to the entire modern world. Unsurprisingly, liberal thinkers across Europe were not amused by the time of his death. Pius IX had become a deeply polarizing figure, beatified by the Church a century later, but remembered by historians as a man who fought modernity with both fists, Latin encyclicals, and a steely glare. After him came Pope Leo XIII, a more diplomatic, intellectual pope who understood that shouting at trains wouldn't stop industrialization. He issued the encyclical Rerum Novarum in 1891, which addressed the rights and duties of capital and labor. It was the Church's first real step into the world of social justice in the modern age. In it, Leo criticized both unfettered capitalism and socialism, calling for the protection of workers and the dignity of labor. It was a shockingly progressive move, and it helped reposition the Church as something more than just a scowling face in a museum of monarchies. Then came the 20th century, a century that would put the papacy through its gravest tests yet. Enter Pope Pius II, who held office during World War II. His legacy remains fiercely debated to this day. On one hand, he maintained Vatican neutrality during the war and worked quietly to help Jews escape the Holocaust. On the other hand, critics argue that he should have spoken out more forcefully, publicly denouncing Hitler and the Nazi regime. His silence, or strategic reserve, depending on one's view, has haunted his papacy ever since. In fairness, it was a treacherous time. The Vatican was surrounded by fascist Italy, and Rome was crawling with spies and soldiers. Open condemnation might have led to direct retaliation, but still, the optics were hard to ignore. After the war, the papacy had to reckon with the reality that moral authority meant little if it wasn't exercised when the world needed it most. Pius X's reign also marked a church still rigid in its doctrine. Mass was still in Latin, priests still faced the altar, and the average Catholic still had little say in church affairs. But not for long, because in 1958, an unassuming Italian cardinal named Angelo Roncalli became Pope John XXIII, and everything changed. John XXIII was elderly and expected to be a placeholder pope. Instead, he shocked the world by calling the Second Vatican Council Vatican II. His aim to drag the church into the modern world with something approaching grace, and drag it he did. The council ran from 1962 to 1965 and was arguably the most radical overhaul of Catholic life since the Council of Trent in the 16th century. It introduced Mass in the vernacular languages, Goodbye Latin, encouraged greater lay participation, opened dialogue with other faiths, and emphasized the Church's role in promoting justice and peace. It was a whirlwind of aggiornamento, bringing up to date, but not everyone was thrilled. Traditionalists saw Vatican II as a betrayal. Old splinter groups broke off, and some bishops quietly resisted implementing the new reforms. The old papal image of an unchanging, immovable rock was now wobbling slightly, and with wobbling came scandal. As the church opened its windows, some long-suppressed issues came tumbling in. Clerical celibacy was debated. Birth control became a lightning rod of controversy. Liberation theology spread through Latin America, often at odds with Vatican orthodoxy. The post-Vatican II church was more vibrant, more global, but also more divided. Yet through it all, the Pope remained a central figure, both a spiritual leader and increasingly a kind of global symbol. When Pope John Paul II came on the scene in 1978, he brought charisma world tours and a stunning ability to connect with millions. A Polish pope during the Cold War, he became a thorn in the side of communist regimes, a champion of human rights, and for some, a kind of saint, even while living. But beneath the triumphs, scandals brewed. The 20th century closed with whispers that would become cries, the mishandling of sexual abuse within the clergy. Accusations of cover-ups moved priests, silenced victims. The very institution that once crowned emperors now faced its own reckoning, not from kings or reformers, but from those it had failed to protect. And that would become the defining scandal of the modern papacy. Not war, not nepotism, not velvet feasts or bronze thefts, but betrayal of trust hidden behind cathedral walls. The story of the popes then had shifted once again from monarchs to managers, from emperors to ethicists. No more horses or crusades. No more Medici mistresses. Just one institution struggling always to live up to the weight of its own claims. Next, we'll trace how the modern papacy tried and is still trying to repair that damage in a world that sees everything and forgives less easily than before. As the 21st century dawned, the papacy found itself standing in a world it had once shaped, now reshaped around it. Modernity didn't knock on the Vatican's doors. It barged in, camera in hand, Wi-Fi enabled, and ready to live stream the next crisis. For an institution built on secrecy, ritual, and slow deliberation, this posed a problem. Papal power now had to compete with public perception, and the scandals that once might have taken decades to surface could now go viral in an afternoon. Nowhere was this shift more painfully obvious than in the sexual abuse crisis that erupted across the Catholic Church. To be clear, abuse cases had existed for decades, centuries, even, but what changed in the early 2000s was that the pattern of cover-up could no longer be contained. Investigative journalists, especially at the Boston Globe, uncovered a network of quiet reassignments, payoffs, sealed documents, and denial stretching all the way up the church hierarchy. Priests accused of abuse had not been punished, they had been relocated. Again and again, the moral authority of the papacy, already strained by modern skepticism, now faced a crisis of credibility. It wasn't just the actions of individual priests, it was the inaction or active concealment by those in charge. People who had grown up taught to trust the church implicitly now felt betrayed. Parishioners left in droves. Lawsuits followed. The financial and spiritual toll was staggering. At the helm during much of this storm was Pope John Paul II, a man widely admired for his charisma, personal holiness, and role in helping bring down communism. But his reluctance to respond decisively to abuse allegations, especially regarding powerful figures like Marcial Maciel, the founder of the Legionaries of Christ, would cast a shadow over his later years. Maciel, as it turned out, had sexually abused seminarians for decades and fathered multiple children, all while being lauded by Vatican insiders. Only after John Paul's death would the full extent of his misdeeds be acknowledged. It was a reminder that personal sanctity does not always translate into institutional accountability. In 2005, John Paul II died after 27 years as Pope, one of the longest and most visible pontificates in history. The world watched as mourners gathered in St. Peter's Square, and his funeral became one of the largest gatherings of world leaders ever. His legacy was vast and deeply complicated, filled with moments of inspiration, but also marked by what many saw as a failure to confront one of the Church's deepest wounds. His successor, Pope Benedict XVI, inherited that wound. Benedict, formerly Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, was a theologian's theologian, soft-spoken, intensely scholarly, and not a natural showman. He took the reins in 2005. Early in his papacy, he began quietly disciplining some of the clergy implicated in abuse scandals, including removing Maciel from public ministry. But the crisis had grown too large for quiet action. Benedict faced growing scrutiny for his own role in previous years, including decisions made when he was head of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, the Vatican office that handled abuse cases. Critics argued that he hadn't acted swiftly enough, and that transparency was still being sacrificed in favor of protecting the institution. Meanwhile, other Vatican dramas began to swirl. Financial scandals involving the Vatican Bank resurfaced. Leaked documents, courtesy of Benedict's own butler, in what became known as the Vaterleaks scandal, revealed power struggles, corruption, and internal backbiting that seemed more suited to a Dan Brown novel than a Holy Office. In 2013, after just 8 years, Benedict did the unthinkable. He resigned. It was the first papal resignation in nearly 600 years. His reasons were framed as physical exhaustion, the weight of responsibility, and an acknowledgement that the church needed someone with more vigor. But in truth, the move sent shockwaves. Was it a retreat in the face of scandal? A quiet admission that the papacy itself had changed, becoming too media-driven, too exposed, too much for one man? Benedict retired to a monastery inside the Vatican, becoming Pope Emeritus, while the cardinals gathered again to choose his successor. Enter Pope Francis, formerly Jorge Mario Bergoglio, Archbishop of Buenos Aires. A Jesuit, a South American, and the first pope from the Western Hemisphere, Francis was a breath of fresh air, and the church made sure everyone noticed. He declined the papal limousine, chose simpler vestments, paid his own hotel bill after the conclave. When asked who he was, he replied a sinner. It was humble branding, done very, very well. Francis emphasized mercy, simplicity, and social justice. He spoke about climate change, refugees, inequality, and the need for the church to be a field hospital after battle. He called for a poor church for the poor, and he gave interviews that felt almost shockingly human. But Francis's papacy has not been scandal-free. Far from it. He has faced fierce criticism for how he's handled ongoing abuse revelations, especially in places like Chile and the United States. Some say he's too lenient on bishops who covered up abuse. Others say his gestures of contrition are too symbolic, not structural. Internally, he's also battled conservative factions within the church who see his reforms as too liberal. Debates over divorced Catholics receiving communion blessings for same-sex couples and decentralizing power have sparked heated divisions, sometimes erupting into open defiance. And hovering behind it all is Benedict XVI, still alive until 2022, quietly reading occasionally, writing, and whether he intended to or not, representing an ideological counterpoint to Francis. The church for a time had two white-robed popes living within the same Vatican walls. It was awkward. Still, Francis remains immensely popular outside traditional church circles. He's been on the cover of Time, Rolling Stone, and even The Advocate. He tweets, he smiles, he hugs babies. And yet, he leads an institution still reckoning with centuries of buried sins, still figuring out how to survive in a world where confession is public and penance must be paid in transparency. The scandals of today are not about feasts or families or cardinals with swords. They are about systemic accountability, global credibility, and the slow grinding work of healing trust. And still the Pope sits in Rome. The chair of Peter stands, the incense rises, because despite it all, despite cadaver trials, excommunications, arrests, nepotism, war, infallibility, silence, resignation, and hashtags, the papacy endures. Next we'll journey into the Vatican itself, not the institution, but the place The rooms, the rituals, the whispered politics behind its ancient walls. Because if scandal has taught us anything, it's that sometimes the setting says just as much as the story. The Vatican. Just the name conjures up marble halls, red slippers, and whispered secrets in a dozen languages. It's the smallest independent state in the world, yet it looms in the global imagination like an empire. And in many ways, it is one of ritual of memory of centuries, layered like fresco upon fresco. If scandal is a constant in papal history, then the Vatican is its theater, its backstage, and occasionally its trapdoor. Let's step inside. The Vatican covers just 109 acres, less than half a square kilometer. But within those walls lie treasures of unimaginable value and corridors that have felt the shuffle of popes, diplomats, spies, and the occasional bewildered tourist. It has its own post office, its own radio station, its own newspaper, and once quite famously, its own astronomer who feuded with Galileo. It even has an ATM with Latin as one of its language options. Because of course it does. The most famous building is St. Peter's Basilica, built over what's believed to be the tomb of St. Peter himself. This colossal church took over a century to build and involved some of the greatest artists of the Renaissance: Michelangelo, Bernini, Bramante. And yes, a few popes who encouraged donations via the ever-problematic indulgence sales. Inside St. Peter's, the atmosphere hums with holiness and politics. Cardinals whisper behind pillars. Tourists snap selfies under the dome. Meanwhile, somewhere nearby, a Swiss guard stands motionless in a Renaissance uniform that looks like it was designed by a very confident curtain maker. These are the visible faces of the Vatican, but the real action happens behind the scenes. The Apostolic Palace is where the Pope lives, though Pope Francis famously opted out of the grand papal apartments in favor of a modest guest suite in Casa Santa Marta. It was a gesture of humility, or at least a carefully calibrated symbol of humility. Popes, after all, understand optics, but whether in apartments grand or plain, the machinery of papal governance churns on. Enter the Roman Curia, the administrative body of the Vatican. Think of it as the Church's cabinet if every department had been founded at least 4 centuries ago and staffed by people who speak fluent Latin and answer to a man in white. The Curia includes congregations, dicasteries, tribunals, and secretariats. It handles everything from appointing bishops to publishing doctrine to investigating miracles. And then there's the College of Cardinals, a body of princes of the Church, who among other things elect new popes. Cardinals are usually bishops, sometimes archbishops, occasionally theologians, and always political. Their selection is as much about spiritual merit as it is about regional influence, ideological alignment, and let's be honest, some good old-fashioned Vatican networking. This network is built in the shadows of routine. Vatican life is surprisingly quiet. Priests and prelates rise early, attend Mass, answer letters, review theological documents, write encyclicals, and hold meetings with people who often use 10 words where 3 would do. The rhythm is methodical, steeped in tradition. But beneath the calm, there's often tension, because the Vatican isn't monolithic. It's filled with factions, progressives and traditionalists, reformers and bureaucrats, optimists and archivists. Some want more lay involvement. Others want to undo Vatican II. Some push for ecological action. Others quietly worry that talking about climate change makes them sound too modern. This factionalism can occasionally break into public view. Leaked memos, dissenting cardinals, whispered rumors about plots and conspiracies. If you listen long enough in St. Peter's Square, you'll hear stories that sound lifted from a Cold War spy novel. And sometimes that's not far off. Take the WaterLeaks scandal of the early 2010s. Confidential documents stolen from Pope Benedict XVI's own desk were released to the media, exposing power struggles, alleged corruption, and a growing sense that the Vatican had become a place where internal politics mattered more than prayer. The leaker, the Pope's butler, you couldn't make it up, or the long simmering saga of the Vatican Bank, officially known as the Institute for the Works of Religion, which sounds much less fun. The bank has been dogged by allegations of money laundering, shady transactions, and missing millions since at least the 1970s. Multiple popes have promised reform, audits have been conducted, and yet every so often another suspicious transaction bubbles to the surface like incense from a misbehaving censer. Then there are the unofficial Vatican mysteries, the alleged secret archives on exorcisms, the whispered cover-ups of wartime activity, the 1982 death of Roberto Calvi, God's banker found hanging under Blackfriars Bridge in London with bricks in his pockets. His bank had ties to the Vatican. His story reads like noir fiction. And no, it has never been fully explained. All this gives the Vatican an aura of intrigue. But the real secret might be how ordinary it can be. Yes, there are grand liturgies, Latin proclamations, and velvet chasubles, but also paperwork-long meetings and arguments about budgets. For every splashy conclave, there are 100 afternoons spent reviewing diocesan statistics from Paraguay. Still, the potential for scandal always lurks, because the stakes are so high. The Vatican doesn't just govern doctrine, it influences billions of people. It intervenes in diplomacy. It speaks to the media. It shapes the narrative of Catholicism itself, which is why the papacy, even when it seems cloistered or ceremonial, still matters. And yet inside these ancient halls, surrounded by gold leaf ceilings and marble saints, the tension between the timeless and the timely is constant. Should the church adapt? Should it double down? Should it speak out or listen? Scandals in this setting aren't just moral failures. They're moments when that tension snaps, when secrecy becomes unsustainable, when a pope's silence roars louder than any sermon. And in the coming sections, we'll explore how modern popes have faced this dilemma, how they've tried to shepherd a global church in an age where nothing stays secret and everything is up for debate. Because while the marble stays polished and the incense continues to rise, the world outside is always knocking. If the Vatican is the stage, the popes are its leading actors, each entering with a script half written, each expected to perform for a global audience while improvising the ending. And like any long-running play, some acts shine, others stumble, and the critics are relentless. In the modern era, the papacy became more visible, more scrutinized, and paradoxically more isolated. Because when you're the most recognizable religious figure on earth, there's no such thing as a private moment. One pope who understood this dynamic with startling clarity was John Paul II. We touched on him earlier, but it's worth pausing to appreciate just how revolutionary his papacy really was. Elected in 1978, John Paul II was the first non-Italian pope in over 450 years. A native of Poland, he entered the papacy with the air of a man who had walked through fire, World War II, communist oppression, personal tragedy, and emerged with his faith intact. He brought with him not only fluency in multiple languages, but also a keen understanding of how media worked. And he used it masterfully. John Paul II became the first rock star pope. He kissed tarmacs, embraced children, faced down dictators, and addressed throngs in stadiums with the confidence of a spiritual quarterback. He logged over 700,000 miles during his papacy, more than 30 trips around the globe. If previous popes had been cloistered monarchs, he was a globe-trotting pastor with a passport and a message. He also played a major role in the Cold War, particularly in undermining communist regimes in Eastern Europe. His visit to Poland in 1979 is widely credited with helping inspire the Solidarity movement, which would eventually contribute to the collapse of Soviet influence in the region. The Kremlin feared him. The people adored him. It was spiritual diplomacy at its most effective. But while John Paul II soared on the world stage, problems brewed at home. The clerical abuse crisis, long festering in silence, began to erupt during his later years. And although John Paul II made important moves, like issuing apologies for past church failings and initiating some procedural reforms, he was also seen as slow to act on specific cases. His fierce loyalty to longtime colleagues and his mistrust of the media led him to defend men who were later revealed to be predators. The result, an erosion of trust that even his canonization in 2014 could not fully restore. Then came Pope Benedict XVI, who, though less charismatic, was intellectually formidable. He inherited a church in crisis, rattled by abuse scandals, divided on doctrine, and navigating a rapidly secularizing world. Benedict was not a natural media figure. Where John Paul had smiled for the camera, Benedict often looked like the camera had surprised him mid-homily. But his resignation in 2013, unprecedented in the modern era, was a deeply human, perhaps even courageous decision. It also shifted expectations forever. The Pope was no longer seen as a king until death, but as a servant who could theoretically step aside. And then came Francis, the first Jesuit Pope, the first from the Americas, the first to choose the name Francis, signaling a commitment to humility and service. When he stepped onto that balcony in 2013 and said simply, "Buona sera," the world noticed. This was a pope who preferred conversation to proclamation, who rode in a Ford Focus instead of a limousine, who paid his hotel bill the morning after being elected. Symbols matter, and Francis wielded them with surgical precision, but symbols can only go so far. Francis has worked to reform Vatican finances, push for ecological responsibility. Laudato Si remains one of the most impactful papal encyclicals of the modern age and create a more inclusive church. He's washed prisoners' feet, met with imams, and hosted interfaith summits. He's championed the poor, the migrant, the outcast, and yet scandal still lingers like incense that never quite clears from the chapel. His papacy has been rocked by fresh revelations of abuse cover-ups, internal resistance to reform, and sharp criticism from conservative factions within the church. Some even accuse him of ambiguity, offering pastoral flexibility without clear doctrinal boundaries. in a church where clarity has long been prized over nuance. This is controversial. Perhaps the most symbolic flashpoint came in 2018 with the case of Theodore McCarrick, a former cardinal accused of decades of abuse. The fact that McCarrick had risen so high within the hierarchy, despite widespread rumors and warnings, was a damning indictment of the church's internal culture. The fallout touched multiple papacies, but it landed hardest on Francis, who was seen as having been too slow or too trusting in handling the case. Even more challenging is the growing call for accountability beyond apologies. Victims of abuse are no longer satisfied with quiet settlements or symbolic gestures. They want structures, changed laws passed, and bishops held personally responsible. The days of quietly transferring a problem priest to a distant diocese are over. The modern world demands transparency, and it does not forget. And so the role of the Pope has changed again. No longer monarch, not quite manager. Perhaps now more of a moderator, trying to keep the global church from tearing itself apart, while also nudging it forward, one foot washing at a time. It's an impossible job, really. And yet, they keep taking it. But through all the turmoil, the papacy still carries a strange kind of gravitas. People still lean in when the Pope speaks, whether to applaud, to argue, or simply to ask, what now? Because even in a secular age, there's something captivating about the idea of a man who stands atop 2 millennia of history, draped in white, carrying not a sword, but a message. Up next, we'll take a look at the enduring legacy of the most scandalous popes in history. Not just what they did wrong, but what their failures teach us about faith power and the strange endurance of the human institution that is the church. What exactly makes a pope scandalous? Is it the money, the mistresses, the massacres, the manipulation of power under the guise of divine right? Or is it something subtler, like the failure to act, to speak, to protect? If the papacy teaches us anything, it's that scandal doesn't always come with a trumpet blast. Sometimes it arrives in a whisper, behind locked doors dressed in silk. Let's take a step back and reflect on what the most notorious popes reveal about the institution they led. Start with Pope Alexander VI of Borgia infamy. He represents the archetype of the corrupt Renaissance pope, opulent, nepotistic, and likely responsible for more than one enemy's mysterious death. His papacy was a family affair. His children lived openly in the Vatican. His son, Cesare, had a military career with a suspiciously high body count, and his daughter, Lucrezia. Let's just say she had a complicated marital history that wouldn't look out of place in a cable drama. But Alexander's scandals weren't just tabloid fodder. They revealed how deeply the papacy had become entangled in worldly ambition. Under him, the Pope wasn't a shepherd, but a prince, one with armies, alliances, and land to protect. In many ways, the scandal was structural. He wasn't the exception. He was the system made flesh. Move on to Pope Leo X, the Medici art lover, who enjoyed hunting parties and declaring, "Let us enjoy the papacy, since God has given it to us." He exuded Renaissance flair, commissioning lavish works and indulging in courtly excess. But it was under his watch that Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to a church door, igniting the Reformation. Leo's scandal wasn't immorality, it was blindness. He didn't see the storm brewing outside the Vatican walls. He didn't recognize that selling indulgences to fund St. Peter's Basilica might just fracture Christendom. In his case, scandal came not from action, but inaction. He fiddled while Wittenberg burned. Then there's Pope Paul IV, who ruled in the 1550s and introduced the first formal ghetto for Jews in Rome. He believed in religious purity to an uncomfortable degree, turning the Inquisition into a fearsome bureaucratic engine. His scandal was theological rigidity to the point of cruelty, a reminder that dogma, when untempered by compassion, becomes a weapon. In more recent history, we have popes like Pius XIII, whose scandal remains the subject of historical debate. Did he do enough during the Holocaust? Was his silence strategic or shameful? His case shows how sometimes a scandal isn't about what a pope does, but what he doesn't say when the world desperately needs a voice. And of course, we come to the modern crisis, sexual abuse and its cover-up. Unlike the sins of the Renaissance, these are not gilded scandals. They are grim, painful, and rooted in systemic failure. For decades, the Church prioritized reputation over reparation. Victims were silenced, abusers were shielded, and the popes, whether through ignorance, inertia, or misplaced loyalty, often did too little too late. It's important to note that not all popes were willing villains. Many were products of their time, shaped by pressures we can only partly understand. The papacy is an office, not a personality. And sometimes the office consumes the man, but therein lies the heart of the matter power. The papacy has always occupied a strange space, earthly and divine sacred, and political human and institutional. That duality is what makes it so compelling and so vulnerable. A pope holds the keys of Peter, but also the keys to enormous wealth, influence, and secrecy. It is an office built on the claim of moral clarity, which makes any failure, any crack impossible to ignore. And yet scandal does something odd. It doesn't destroy the papacy, it shapes it. After the Borgia excesses came the Counter-Reformation. After Leo X's blunders came the Council of Trent. After the silence of Pius XIII came the global awareness of John Paul II. And after decades of abuse, cover-ups came efforts at reform, however halting and imperfect. The Church lumbers forward, battered but upright, always halfway between ruin and renewal, because the papacy, for all its faults, adapts. It has outlived empires, dictators, and revolutions. It has survived exiles, schisms, and scandals. Why? Partly because of its spiritual mission, but also because it learns slowly, painfully from its mistakes. Or rather, it's forced to. Modern popes walk a tightrope. They must preserve tradition while confronting change. They must be pastors and CEOs, mystics and media managers. They are judged not just by their sermons, but by their silence. Not just by their theology, but by their transparency. In a world with 24-hour news cycles and Twitter threads, every scandal is global. Every misstep is archived. And yet the white smoke still rises. People still gather in St. Peter's Square. Pilgrims still line up to see the bones of Peter. Something in the papacy endures, not just despite scandal, but in part because of how scandal reveals the human fragility behind the divine claim. So as we continue, we'll explore what this all means for the future of the papacy. Is it evolving? Is it retreating? Or is it simply waiting for the next chapter to begin? Because history doesn't end. And neither, apparently, do papal scandals. To look ahead, we have to admit, something most history books politely sidestep. The papacy is, and always has been, a paradox. It's an institution that claims divine guidance, yet is run by men flawed, fallible, and frequently embroiled in worldly messes. It's a symbol of unity that has lived through schisms, a champion of peace that once raised armies, a beacon of morality that has repeatedly been at the center of moral collapse. And still it endures. Why? Partly because of belief. For over 1 billion Catholics, the Pope is more than a man. He is a successor to St. Peter the Rock, on which Christ declared he would build his church. That symbolic weight matters especially in times of chaos. People cling to the papacy not because it is perfect, but because it promises continuity in a world where very little is. But belief alone doesn't explain the survival of an office that has, let's face it, made some spectacular missteps over the centuries. The other reason the papacy persists is its ability to evolve while appearing not to. A delicate dance. Change too fast and you fracture your base. Change too slowly and you become irrelevant. The papacy's trick, its genius, even is to reframe change as continuity. Take the recent popes. John Paul II embraced media, traveled like a statesman, and helped topple communism. Yet he remained doctrinally conservative, holding firm on issues like contraception and the male priesthood. He modernized the image of the Pope without changing the theology. Benedict XVI was the scholar pope, cautious and traditional, who nevertheless shocked the world by resigning a move so unprecedented that it practically rewrote the papal rulebook. Francis wears no red shoes, lives in a modest guest house, and talks like a parish priest on a bicycle. Yet even he treads carefully on doctrinal landmines, couching reform in pastoral language rather than explosive declarations. In short, each pope has moved the church in some direction, but never so quickly that the institution breaks. It's not revolution. It's a 2,000-year slow shuffle. Still, the pace is accelerating. Today's papacy faces challenges that make past crises look almost quaint. The sexual abuse crisis remains unresolved in many regions. Financial transparency is an ongoing battle, with the Vatican Bank still making headlines. And new issues have emerged that past popes never imagined. What does the Church say about artificial intelligence, climate collapse, global migration, gender identity, digital addiction? These are not theoretical debates. They are pastoral ones. Priests, bishops, and faithful are wrestling with these questions in real time, and they're looking to Rome for guidance. The Pope must speak to both theologians and teenagers scrolling Instagram. And that's not easy. And then there's the question of representation. The Catholic Church is increasingly global. The center of gravity is shifting away from Europe and toward Latin America, Africa, and Asia. Yet the structures of power, curial appointments, Vatican officials, even papal elections still tilt heavily European. How long can that last? Francis has begun addressing this. He's elevated cardinals from places like the Philippines, the Congo, and El Salvador. He's hinted that future popes could and perhaps should come from beyond the traditional Italian, French, Spanish, German orbit. A Nigerian pope, a Brazilian pope. These are no longer wild hypotheticals, but with that diversity comes tension. The cultural gaps between dioceses in Germany and Nigeria, for example, are immense. One is debating same-sex blessings and secularization. The other is dealing with persecution and explosive growth. How does one pope address both without alienating either? This is the scandal of relevance. The Church must find a way to speak universally in a world that is deeply fractured. And the Pope, whoever he is, must be a kind of spiritual linguist, translating doctrine into compassion without losing the plot. There's also the strange pressure of celebrity. Modern popes are global figures. They're on magazine covers, on Twitter, in documentaries. They are expected to have quotable lines, hug babies, weigh in on global politics, and look photogenic doing it. The temptation to perform rather than shepherd is very real. Papal charisma, once optional, now feels required. Yet the most pressing scandal of the modern papacy may not be any single issue, but the risk of irrelevance. We live in a world where fewer people identify with organized religion, where church attendance is declining in many countries, where moral authority is no longer presumed, it has to be earned and constantly renewed. In this context, the Pope is no longer the final word on anything. He's one voice among many, and he's expected not only to speak wisely, but to listen. So what does the future look like? There's speculation about reforming the papacy itself. Some theologians suggest term limits for popes. Others propose greater power sharing with bishops or laity. There's talk of decentralization, allowing regional bishops' conferences more authority to shape pastoral responses. The idea of infallibility, defined just over 150 years ago, may face new scrutiny in an age allergic to absolutes. But even amid change, some things will remain. The white cassock, the balcony at St. Peter's, the weight of 2,000 years. The fact that the man who holds the title still signs his name with PP for Pontifex Pontificum, bridge builder of bridges. That's the enduring metaphor. The Pope is meant to be a bridge between past and present, between heaven and earth, between the Church and a world that's not always listening. And perhaps that's the ultimate scandal, that despite everything, the failures, the cover-ups, the politics, the robes, the rituals, people still look to the man in white, not because he is perfect, but because they hope he might somehow still carry the light. In our next section, we'll turn our gaze outward to the legacy these scandals have left behind, not in the Vatican, but in the hearts and minds of the faithful, because history doesn't only live in marble halls. Sometimes it's buried in pews and whispered in prayer. Let's leave the frescoed walls of the Vatican for a moment and step into the quiet hush of a pew, not in Rome, but perhaps in a small church in Ireland, or a cathedral in Pennsylvania, or a chapel in the Philippines, nestled among palm trees and corrugated roofs. These are the places where the legacies of scandal land hardest, not in headlines or Vatican press briefings, but in the lived experience of the faithful, those who come to church not to rule or reform, but to pray. Because while popes make history, it's ordinary Catholics who live with the consequences. In recent decades, many believers have found themselves caught in a painful paradox: deep love for their faith and deep disappointment in its leaders. They've watched their parishes shrink their priest's age, and the trust they once took for granted quietly erode. For victims of clerical abuse, That disappointment has often turned into trauma, made worse by the realization that for years, the very institution they turned to for comfort actively covered up their pain. The betrayal was not just of the body, but of the soul. And the Pope, no matter how sincere or sorrowful, cannot undo that wound with a handshake and a prayer. But scandal doesn't always destroy faith. Sometimes it refines it. Many Catholics have responded not by abandoning the church, but by reclaiming it from the ground up. Lay people have formed advocacy groups, demanded transparency, and pushed for reforms at diocesan and national levels. Survivors have become witnesses. Silence, once imposed by shame or deference, has given way to public testimony. This movement hasn't always been welcomed by the hierarchy. Some within the Vatican still view lay activism as disorderly, too democratic, too loud. But in truth, it's one of the most Catholic things possible. From the very beginning, the Church has been shaped by its people, not just its popes. The earliest Christians met in homes. The great councils were often prompted by public outcry. Reform has never come from above alone. That's especially true now, because modern Catholics are more educated, more connected, and less deferential than ever before. They expect answers, not platitudes. They read papal encyclicals and compare them to policy decisions. They Google canon law. They tweet at bishops. They're done whispering. And the papacy, if it wants to remain credible, has had to respond. Pope Francis has encouraged this engagement, at least rhetorically. His calls for synodality, a more inclusive listening church, are a recognition that the age of top-down governance is over. Synods, long viewed as sleepy, theological conferences are being reframed as platforms for dialogue, especially on hot-button issues like LGBTQ+, inclusion married priests, and women's roles in the church. But dialogue isn't easy. And not all Catholics agree on what renewal should look like. In fact, one of the most underreported scandals of our time may be the polarization within the global church itself. In Germany, bishops are exploring blessings for same-sex couples. In parts of Africa, priests are preaching against the influence of Western liberalism. In the US Catholic Twitter is a battlefield of ideologies progressives calling for full reform traditionalists, quoting Latin prayers like they're wielding swords. And all the while, the Pope tries to hold it together, not with decrees or anathemas, but with gestures. A phone call here, a foot washing there. His approach at times feels almost improvisational, less like steering a ship, more like playing jazz on a very old pipe organ. Still many Catholics remain, some out of habit, some out of hope, some because even when the institution disappoints, the faith still calls. The sacraments still nourish, the saints still whisper. The idea that the church is something deeper than the men who mismanage it, that endures. It's a delicate balance. Scandal breaks things, trust most of all. And yet, the church is full of stories about broken things that get redeemed. Peter denied Christ, Augustine stole pears. Francis of Assisi was a rich kid with no direction. And yet, somehow, they all got woven into the tapestry, which raises a thorny, beautiful question. Can the papacy itself be redeemed? Some would say it already has been many times. Others argue it's beyond saving, that the structure itself invites abuse. But most Catholics live in the middle space, holding grief In one hand, grace in the other. In that space scandal is not the end of faith. It's the testing of it. Not a test that comes with answers, but with presence. The simple act of staying, of showing up even when the institution has let you down, of lighting a candle in a church whose leadership may not deserve your loyalty, but whose sanctuary still offers silence, beauty, and mystery. Because belief is not the same as naivety, and love doesn't mean looking away. The modern papacy, like the church it leads, is wrestling with that truth. It's trying to be accountable without collapsing, honest without losing hope. It's a slow, uneven process, but it's real, and so the pews remain, some empty, some full, some silent, some singing, but still there. Up next, we'll explore how scandal shapes not just institutions, but memory. How the reputations of popes are revisited, revised, even resurrected across time. Because in the Catholic Church, no story is ever truly over, especially not a scandal. History is a tricky business, especially when it comes to popes. Their reputations aren't set in stone, not even the marble kind, carved lovingly in Vatican crypts. In fact, papal legacies tend to shift with the winds of time. Scandalous today, saintly tomorrow, or sometimes the other way around. Because when your job comes with the title Vicar of Christ, people tend to hold on to your biography like a sacred text and occasionally revise it like a Wikipedia article. Let's start with the posthumous glow-up known as beatification and canonization. Many popes, even some with checkered tenures, are declared blessed or saint years after their deaths. The process is complex and includes evaluating miracles, but it also reflects a desire to recognize spiritual leadership despite flaws. It's both commemoration and political messaging. This pope mattered, and here's why. Take Pope John Paul II, canonized in 2014, just 9 years after his death, a lightning-fast pace by Vatican standards. To many, he was a spiritual titan, a globe-trotting pastor, an anti-communist warrior, a poet of hope. His funeral drew millions. The chants of Santo Subito Saint now echoed across St. Peter's Square, but not everyone was on board. Critics argued that canonizing John Paul ignored the elephant in the nave, his slow response to a few scandals, his defense of Martial Maciel, his tight circle of trusted aides, who in hindsight should not have been trusted. Was his personal holiness enough to eclipse institutional failure? And what about Pope Pius IX, the 19th century pope who declared papal infallibility and published the infamous Syllabus of Errors? He was beatified in 2000. The move raised eyebrows. Pius IX was revered by traditionalists, yes, but he also reigned during a time of deep hostility toward liberal ideas, Jewish communities, and modern society. In short, not exactly Mr. Rogers with a mater, yet the Church framed his beatification as a recognition of personal sanctity, not political savvy. Still, the tension remained. Can you venerate a pope without endorsing his policies? Can a holy man also be a problematic one? Then there are popes whose reputations have improved over time, not through miracles, but through reassessment. Pope Honorius. I was condemned as a heretic by a later council. For centuries, he was the go-to example for critics of papal infallibility. Yet modern scholars argue that he was misunderstood, and his condemnation was more about unclear wording than actual heresy. In effect, Honorius was a victim of bad email etiquette in the 7th century. Or consider Pope Formosus, the poor fellow dug up during the Cadaver Synod. At the time, his reputation was shredded literally, but modern history views him as the tragic scapegoat of factional politics. The real villain, most agree, was Pope Stephen VI, who orchestrated the whole grotesque affair. Even the notorious Borgia Pope Alexander VI has been given a small measure of historical sympathy. Not a lot, let's not get carried away, but some. Historians now contextualize his actions within the broader politics of Renaissance Italy, a time when moral ambiguity was practically baked into the job description. He wasn't uniquely corrupt. He was just the most memorable about it. This kind of reputational revision isn't unique to popes, of course. But because popes are supposed to represent moral authority, the stakes are higher. A flawed pope challenges the very idea of divine guidance. So the Church has developed a delicate balancing act, recognizing mistakes without undermining legitimacy. And then there are the popes whose legacies remain frozen, not because of lack of interest, but because the wounds are still too raw. Pope Benedict XVI is one such figure. Some see him as a brave theologian who stepped aside for the good of the Church. Others view him as a failed administrator who didn't confront abuse aggressively enough. He was a brilliant mind, but not perhaps the right man for a world where symbolism and optics matter more than academic nuance. As for Pope Francis, his legacy is still being written, often in real time, on social media. Some hail him as a breath of fresh air, a reformer who leads with compassion. Others accuse him of diluting doctrine, sowing confusion, or being too political. Francis has made many gestures of reform, but has struggled to push structural change through an institution famous for its inertia. And yet there's something quietly remarkable about the papacy's endurance through all this. Most institutions would crumble under the weight of even one or two of these scandals. The papacy, it incorporates them. A scandal becomes a council. A controversy becomes doctrine. A heresy becomes an eventual footnote. Somehow, it survives. Part of that survival comes from Catholic theology itself, especially its emphasis on mystery paradox and human fallibility. The Church does not promise that its leaders will be saints while alive, only that they try. And when they fail, there is confession, there is penance, there is ideally reform. Of course, in practice, the confession sometimes comes decades late, and the penance might involve a luxury retirement villa and a quiet reassignment. But even these failures get folded into the larger narrative. That's why scandal and sainthood are not mutually exclusive in papal history, because every saint was a sinner, and apparently every pope was at least a little bit of both. So, as we look back at the rogues, reformers, cowards, crusaders, mystics, and managers who've worn the white cassock, we do so not with blind reverence, but with a kind of historical affection. They were, after all, human, occasionally very, very human. In the next section, we'll bring the story to a slow, thoughtful simmer. A look at how the papacy, as scarred and strange as it is, continues to fascinate us, comfort us, and yes, scandalize us. Because the final act of any papal story isn't scandal, it's reflection. There's something quietly astonishing about the fact that the papacy still exists. Not just that it physically survives with its balconies and basilicas, its tiaras stored in dusty vaults, and its ancient Latin titles, but that it still matters. That in a world driven by market economies, streaming algorithms, and political cycles measured in tweets, people still pause to listen when a man in white steps out onto a balcony and says simply, Buonasera. Why does it persist? Why do we keep watching popes, writing about them, arguing over them? Because the papacy, for all its scandals and missteps, is more than a religious office. It's a mirror. Not always a flattering one, but a mirror nonetheless. Look closely, and you'll see reflections of history's grandest questions. How should power be used? What does it mean to lead? Can authority coexist with humility? Can institutions built on sacred ideals endure the pressures of human failure? The Pope at his best tries to answer these questions with grace. At his worst, he becomes the question himself, and so the fascination continues. In part, it's the drama. The papacy offers a centuries-long saga of betrayal, redemption, secrecy, revelation, grandeur, collapse, and improbable recovery. Shakespeare would have killed to write this story, and in many ways, the story's already written itself better than fiction could dare. We've had warrior popes who led armies and whispered assassinations, hermit popes dragged from caves and crowned against their will, teenage popes installed by aristocratic families who viewed the papacy as a well-dressed pawn, reforming popes who tried to clean the stables and got buried beneath the manure, visionary popes who saw new paths forward and left behind confusion and unintended consequences. It's theater, but it's also theology. It's human weakness wrapped in incense and Latin. And despite it all, or maybe because of it, the papacy speaks to something ancient in us. A longing for continuity, for someone to sit at the center and say, here is where we stand, even if we disagree, even if we walk away. The idea that someone is still tending the flame means something. That's why every scandal, no matter how appalling, becomes a part of the larger story. Not a footnote, but a plot point. Because the papacy is, if nothing else, a long story. It absorbs contradiction. It survives backlash. It changes. Slowly, awkwardly, and with an audible creaking of old wood. But it changes, and it leaves behind a trail of lessons. For one, the Church is not immune to the same flaws that afflict every human organization. Its leaders can be corrupted, confused, complicit, or simply overwhelmed. Faith in God does not grant immunity from bad judgment. Holy orders are not a vaccine against moral failure. But there's another lesson: transparency matters. Scandal thrives in the dark. But when the spotlight turns on, painful as it is, there's a chance for healing, for truth, and for growth. The modern popes who've made the most progress are not necessarily the most doctrinally radical, but the ones willing to name the wound out loud. And a third lesson: accountability must be structural, not just personal. It's not enough to remove a bad actor. The system that allowed the harm has to be examined, reformed, and sometimes torn up by the roots. That's a slow, brutal process in any institution. In one built on tradition and ritual, it can feel nearly impossible. But it's necessary. So where does that leave us? with the papacy still standing, still speaking, still trying. A papacy that has outlived emperors, ideologies, revolutions, and the Renaissance. A papacy that has been both persecuted and privileged, that has crowned kings, been imprisoned, been mocked, and been mourned. A papacy that has done breathtaking good in the world, caring for the poor, defending human dignity, championing peace, and also done immense harm. And yet it continues, perhaps because it's built on contradiction, perhaps because it asks hard questions, or perhaps because it offers something few institutions still dare, to the belief that even when everything else falters, there is value in trying again. Not because we think we'll get it right this time, but because not trying is the true scandal. In the final sections, we'll begin winding down. We'll soften the light, lower the voices, and let the centuries settle into a quieter hum. Because this has been a long journey through catacombs and conclaves, scandals and smoke, and now we drift toward rest. We've wandered through centuries of scandal, shuffled through marble corridors, peeked into velvet-draped bedrooms, and paused in dim confessionals, thick with incense and irony. And now, as the echoes of history begin to soften, it's time to ask, what does the papacy look like when we stop squinting at its flaws and just let it be what it is? A strange, stubborn survivor. Because let's be honest, if the papacy were invented today, no committee would approve it. A single man in white robes claiming apostolic authority, stretching back 2 millennia, tasked with governing doctrine for over 1 billion people across wildly different cultures, political systems, and moral frameworks, chosen in secret, elected for life, residing in a literal palace. And yet there it is, still waving from balconies, still sending out encyclicals, still writing tweets that toggle between pray for peace and remember the poor, while being retweeted by everyone, from theologians to armchair atheists. The papacy is in every sense anachronistic, but that may be part of its appeal. It doesn't try to keep pace with the news cycle. It doesn't pretend to be cool. It doesn't pivot every 6 months like a startup. Instead, it waits. It prays. It blesses. It processes. It holds the same line it's held since Peter walked barefoot through the dust of Jerusalem and got nervous around servant girls. And that odd stability, sometimes infuriating, sometimes comforting, is why people still turn to it, especially in moments of chaos. But stability is not the same as stagnation. The papacy has always had to evolve, just slowly enough to look like it's not evolving. Think of the shifts, from Latin-only Mass to vernacular languages, from tiaras and thrones to folding chairs and foot washings, from condemning Galileo to hosting observatories, from banning Protestants to praying with them, from declaring the Pope infallible to watching one voluntarily resign. These are not just PR adjustments. They are tectonic shifts in identity disguised as ritual. And beneath those rituals, people. Always people. Not just the ones in mitres and robes, but the millions who look up from pews, kitchen tables, prison cells, refugee camps, hospital beds, and wonder what the man in white might say today. Because the papacy, for all its grandeur, is ultimately judged by the personal. One pope's decision to meet with victims instead of ignore them. Another's refusal to use warlike rhetoric. another's choice to live simply even when surrounded by marble. These small gestures add up. They tell a story that's sometimes more powerful than dogma. But it's also true that many people have stopped watching. For some, the scandals were too much, the excuses too familiar, the apologies too late. For them, the papacy became background noise, a once bright melody now muffled by distrust. And that's fair. No one owes the church their loyalty, yet some still stay, quietly, not because they think the papacy is perfect, but because it reminds them of something possible, a kind of slow, ancient, stubborn hope, a belief that even the messiest institution can be used for something good, that even imperfect people can speak truth, that even a scandalous pope might in some way still serve the divine. That's the mystery. Not that the papacy exists, but that it keeps trying, keeps showing up, keeps struggling to live up to its own impossible calling to be holy while being human. So what do we do with all this? We remember. We acknowledge the darkness. We refuse to forget the pain caused in God's name. But we also refuse to give up on the idea that things can change, that power can be held differently, that humility can wear white robes, and maybe on a quiet night like this, we even allow ourselves a little hope, not in popes necessarily, but in people, in those who show up for daily mass, in the nuns teaching refugees how to read, in the layperson who speaks truth to power at a parish council, in the priest who listens more than he talks, in the journalist who exposes abuse, in the victim who tells their story, in the cardinal who risks his career for reform, in the tired, aching church itself, still trying to be better, one slow miracle at a time. We're nearing the end now. Just a few more steps. The scandals don't disappear, but they soften. They settle into memory, into prayer, into possibility. Because after all this, after 6 hours of scandal and saints and sword-wielding popes, you deserve something quieter. By now the incense has faded. The crowds in St. Peter's Square have gone home. The bells have stopped tolling. We've walked through the centuries together, stepping around the papal tiaras and dodging the occasional excommunication. And it's finally time to catch our breath. The truth is, scandal has always been part of the papacy's DNA, not because the church is uniquely broken, but because it's uniquely visible. When the Pope stumbles, the world notices. When a bishop fails, the whole institution trembles. And when a Vatican official tries to quietly retire with a golden parachute and a manservant named Giacomo, someone leaks it to the press. The papacy invites scrutiny because it promises more than most institutions dare to. Not just competence, not just leadership, but moral clarity. A sense that someone somewhere still believes in right and wrong, still believes in confession and redemption. And when that promise cracks, the scandal feels not just disappointing, but personal. Yet even now, after all we've covered from cadaver synods to Vatican leaks, mistresses to martyrs, the story of the papacy remains weirdly inspiring. Precisely because it's so flawed, it reminds us that striving matters, that institutions can change even if they take centuries and several awkward councils to do it, that holiness doesn't mean perfection, it means persistence. Most people don't remember the policies, they remember the moments, the image of John Paul II forgiving his would-be assassin, Francis washing the feet of a Muslim woman in prison, Benedict walking away from the papacy with shaking hands. These are human acts, not divine ones, but they speak louder than most homilies. And maybe that's the best defense of the papacy for all its mess, that it has survived itself. Because let's be honest, any organization that lasts 2,000 years and still holds press conferences is doing something right, or at least something remarkably persistent. The scandals, though painful, often serve as punctuation marks. Not full stops, but commas. They force the institution to pause, rethink, revise. Even when the corrections are slow and messy, they matter. And while apologies don't erase wounds, they open the door to healing. That's the tension the papacy must live with. It can never fully atone for its past, but it can bear witness to it. And in bearing witness, it becomes something stronger, not in spite of its scars, but because of them. Think of the Vatican now. Silent corridors lit by flickering sconces, the ancient archives sleeping under layers of dust and digital locks. A cardinal walking briskly to a meeting he'll pretend to enjoy. Somewhere in a quiet chapel, a nun prays for the next pope, not because she knows who he'll be, but because she knows what he'll carry. The weight of history, the eyes of the world, and a pair of shoes that are never ever easy to fill. And still, when the white smoke rises, when the Latin name is announced from the loggia, when the world leans in to hear who next, there's a ripple of hope. Maybe this one will get it right, or at least a little more right than the last, because at its best, the papacy doesn't point to itself. It points beyond, to humility, to service, to the persistent, quietly radical idea that love, when lived fully, can actually change things, even marble things, even Vatican things. And that's why, scandal or no scandal, people still watch, still wonder, still whisper prayers, not for perfection, just for courage. If you've made it this far through centuries of robes and regrets, of holy declarations and unholy alliances, of scrolls and scandals and slow-moving reform, then congratulations, you've done what most popes never could: sit still for more than 10 minutes and reflect honestly. The papacy is one of those institutions that defies tidy conclusions. It isn't a success story. It isn't a cautionary tale. It's a contradiction that somehow keeps functioning. A divine office housed in very human hands. And that tension, that beautiful, uncomfortable tension, is what makes it so endlessly fascinating. You see, the popes aren't superheroes. They're not meant to be. They're spiritual administrators with an impossible mandate: preserve 2,000 years of theology, lead the largest religion on earth, and do it all with grace, wisdom, and ideally, no international incidents. It's no wonder they falter. What's more surprising is how often they rise. In fact, part of what keeps the papacy alive is its ability to learn in public. Sometimes slowly, sometimes stubbornly, but with just enough humility to admit that mistakes were made, and just enough hope to believe they can be corrected. Take the more recent popes, John Paul II, who redefined the papacy for the modern era, but left behind unresolved crises. Benedict XVI, who brought rare intellectual clarity and even rarer personal honesty when he stepped down. Francis, who's trying to lead a global church with a shepherd's heart and a reformer's to-do list, despite resistance at nearly every level. Each one inherits the same title, successor of Peter, but each wears it differently. Some wear it like armor, others like a shroud. A few seem to carry it like a cross, but all of them, in their own flawed ways, are part of a centuries-long relay race. And the baton they pass is not perfection, but perseverance. And yes, scandals are baked into that history. Popes who embezzled, popes who murdered, popes who fathered children, ran armies, kissed dictators, and whispered secrets behind velvet drapes. The rogues gallery is long, often absurd, and rarely boring. But the papacy's scandalous past doesn't negate its spiritual reach. For many believers, the Pope is still a symbol of unity, a figure who stands above politics, above regions, above the noise. Not because he's infallible, but because he's trying to point to something beyond himself. That's the curious alchemy of the office. It can turn brokenness into caution, regret into wisdom. The worst chapters become moral compasses, if not for the Pope, then for the people watching. And they are watching. From balconies and basements, from pews and prison cells, from monasteries and modern apartments filled with quiet, questioning faith. For them, the papacy isn't just about leadership. It's about legacy. What does the Church choose to remember? What does it choose to forget? And what, if anything, does it finally learn? Perhaps the greatest irony is that for an institution obsessed with eternity, the papacy is shaped entirely by time. Every pope is a product of his moment, his politics, his crises, his limitations. But if he does his job well, he speaks to something that transcends the moment, something slow, something sacred, and maybe, just maybe something scandalous in the best sense, a challenge to the comfortable, a rebuke to the powerful, a reminder that even the oldest institutions must keep changing if they hope to stay alive. So here we are nearly at the end, not with answers, those are rare in Rome, but with a little more clarity and maybe a touch more empathy. The papacy is not what we sometimes wish it were. It's what it's always been, a very human office, trying to hold up a very divine ideal. It rarely succeeds, but it keeps trying, and maybe that's enough. So here we are, finally, at the last chapter in our long, winding, occasionally wine-soaked journey through the scandalous history of the popes. The tiaras are packed away, the conclave doors are closed, and even the ghosts of Renaissance cardinals have settled down to sleep. Let's ease out of the centuries now, slowly, gently. You've heard about popes who schemed and sinned, popes who ruled with iron fists or soft sighs. You've visited dark dungeons and glittering chapels. You've watched as spiritual leaders turned into warlords and reformers became martyrs of bureaucracy. And through it all, one thing has stayed constant, the impossible tension between who the Pope is and who the Pope is supposed to be. That tension is what gives the papacy its strange power. Not infallibility, not gold, not even tradition. It's the constant reminder that holiness must struggle with history, that ideals are often born out of imperfection, and that, maybe, just maybe, the most enduring institutions are the ones that never stop asking if they're getting it wrong. But we're not ending on scandal. No, we're ending on stillness. Because despite everything, there's a quiet grace that clings to the edges of the papacy. Not the grand gestures or the headlines, but the smaller things. The candle lit in an empty chapel. The ancient chant echoing through a marble corridor. The aged Pope bent in prayer, unseen, unheard, except by the one who called him to this work in the first place. In the silence of the Vatican gardens at night, beneath the cypress trees and the soft shuffle of old sandals on stone, the noise of centuries fades. There is no debate, no denunciation, no scandal sheet to read or press release to dodge. Only the long breath of history exhaling. It's here in this stillness that the papacy sheds its armor. No thrones, no titles, just the weight of a fisherman's burden and the hope that somehow the church can still be what it was meant to be. Not perfect, but penitent. Not triumphant, but humble. Not powerful, but healing. And if that vision still flickers, even after everything, then maybe there's something sacred left to hold on to. So let the bells go quiet. Let the white robes hang undisturbed. Let the old books rest on their shelves. You've seen what lies behind the walls. You've heard the stories they don't teach in catechism. And yet you're still here, listening, breathing, wondering. That perhaps is the real miracle. And now, let it all go. Let the centuries drift, like incense smoke curling upward into the night. Let the scandals soften into whispers. Let the marble halls fade into shadow. We've walked a long road together, past iron gates and velvet chairs, through prayer's power and paradox. There's nothing left to chase. No conclave left to cover. No papal ring left to kiss. Just the quiet hum of history and the soft truth that no one pope or peasant is ever quite beyond redemption. Close your eyes, if they're not already closed. Picture the lights dimming in Rome, the piazza empty, the moon hanging over the dome of St. Peter's like a guardian too tired to judge. Let the stillness hold you. Let the centuries rest. Let the sleep come slowly, kindly, like an old friend taking your hand. Because tonight, scandal has finally given way to silence, and silence at last gives way to peace.